I hope you enjoyed part 1 of the debate. In the course of the edit of the debate, I made an error, and I wanted to apologize up front about that. Aaron and Kam specifically told me after the debate, once it was already live, that this was the most important piece of evidence. So I wanted to play back the part where the slide was not present in. By the way, I had to add them manually. People are saying I'm taking things out. I didn't take anything out. I had to add things for the sake of having Aaron's and Kam's presentation. So that's what I did. This piece got left out.
Now, what Eisenman's saying here is that the Ebionim, the Ebionites go back to the Ebionim from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, for example, the Pesher on the Psalms, fragment 1 through 2, column 1, line 23, we have this self-designation, the congregation of the Ebionim, the community of the Ebionim. And so here's the Hebrew from the actual document, the Psalm Pesher. And this is pretty widespread through the Dead Sea Scrolls, this congregation of the Ebionim. And so when we get into the connection between Ebionim and Ebionites, again, we have a lot of patristic attestation for this, but this is from the G. Uhlhorn Religious Encyclopedia.
You just can't debate Jesus and not have just a little bit of controversy. Again, I apologize if this offended anybody, and enjoy part 2. And let us know in the comments whose argument is more compelling.
I actually think that the issue of the divinity of Christ is probably, because I think what I'm sensing is that this is an important issue, but I also I think that a number of core issues in regards to this conversation is that Kam and Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, you would say that Jesus is God, but not in a unique way that separates us from him.
Well, yeah, I would say that, right? I would say that Jesus is God, but to claim Jesus is exclusively God is where I would disagree. I don't think it's ontologically possible for anyone to be exclusively God. And so obviously coming from a mystical background, I ascribe to oneness, the oneness model of divinity, which says that God is in all of us. And Jesus realized his oneness with God. I and the Father are one. And I think we have a lot of attestation from Jesus in the New Testament showing this fact of, hey, when you don't love the least of these, you don't love me. Clearly showing he sees himself in these people. And if you don't love them, don't come calling me Lord, Lord, and expect to get into my kingdom. If you don't follow my greatest commandment, I don't know who you are. And of course, other quotes, which we could mention as well, John 17, praying we would all be one. So I think where you guys would differentiate from us would be that you believe Jesus is exclusively God. Is that right?
In the sense that John chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1, and Hebrew chapter 1 says that all things were created through and by and in Jesus, that he is the author of creation. Well, yeah, I don't think, Jesus, Aaron, though. You would say, yeah, it does. Yeah.
John 1?
Well, John 1 excludes anything.
Nothing was made without him. Yeah, nothing was made without him that was made.
We would draw a difference between Christ and Jesus. Jesus being the man, Christ being the consciousness or the divinity, and seeing John 1 as speaking to the Christ principle in the man Jesus.
Yeah, I don't think that that's a possibility exegetically within
the church.
Scripture.
Yeah, the church addressed this in 431, by the way, at the Council of Ephesus. It's called Nestorianism, that Jesus was 50-50, rather than a hypostatic union, as Cyril of Alexandria coined the term. So
could I hop in really quick? Because here's the thing. Christology has been argued for a long time.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't even know that anyone.
Kam, this is the core of this. Like, we need to get down to the bottom of what you guys really believe, and it sounds to me this is.
I believe Jesus is God, but I believe that he stood up against animal sacrifice. I think that I accepted Jesus as God a long time ago, and it's been my belief my entire life. My point is though, Anton, is that I don't think that Jesus being God, there's so many other, you can talk to so many people from other religions that believe their person is God. Mm-hmm. What we want to talk about that makes Jesus unique from this particular position that we feel no one's talking about, and in fact, Epiphanius and some of the church fathers were maybe trying to hand wave away a bit as heresy, was that there is a thread of anti-sacrificial ritual amongst the prophets that Jesus then realized fully and embodied when he disrupted the temple animal sacrifice. And there's not a single other spiritual leader on planet Earth in history that has ever done that. I think that's the most unique thing that we want to bring to the table to talk about Jesus, is that he's standing up against
I think
bloodshed
the most unique thing
and
Jesus
violence.
did was resurrect from the dead.
Well, that's amazing too. Yeah, but what I'm saying is this is later. We don't disagree with
Well,
Jesus'
no, I
resurrection
think
either.
Aaron does disagree based off what he just said. Because Aaron, do you believe you are God?
No, absolutely not. No one is God.
Okay.
No one person.
Not even
clip.
Jesus.
I have a clip I want to pull up really quick.
I want to get back to Cam's question too.
It's going to be so, because our position that we brought to the table is specific.
Our position is that Jesus never told people they had to believe in Christological facts about his nature to be saved. There is no confess me as Lord in the mouth of Jesus. There is no believe in my death and resurrection in the mouth of Jesus. And so whether or not Jesus, even if your Christology is perfectly correct, we don't think that that's the way Jesus wanted you to follow to be saved, but to follow his teachings, to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. That would be our unique position to offer.
Okay, but let me just play this really quick because I just want clarity.
So, hold on. So in John 18, or John 8:24, when Jesus says, "Unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins." How do you interpret that?
Yeah, that's actually or at least I'll speak for myself. How I see what God is I am. In obviously in Deuteronomy, when God reveals himself to Moses at the burning bush, he designates himself as I am that I am. And so if somebody asks me, Aaron, what is God or who is God? I would say God is the first person in the present tense. I am. God is the way we are aware. God is the consciousness by which we know ourselves. And so in the I am statements of Jesus, I read them and interpret them as Jesus speaking from that state, the I am state. And maybe you would disagree with that. I'm not sure.
So how would denying that make you die in your sins from a Jewish perspective?
Well, yeah. So when Jesus says, believe in me, my interpretation of that is very clear. Jesus never said believing in me means confessing me as Lord or believing in my resurrection. He says over and over in the book of John 14:15, if you love me, obey my commandments. The one who has my commandments and keeps them is the one that loves me. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? So to us, to believe in Jesus is to believe in what Jesus represents, what he taught, what he showed, what he commanded us. And so Jesus is very stern with his followers. If you don't do what I say, you don't follow me, you don't love me. And so that's what believe in Jesus means in our interpretation.
And the scriptures seem to allude that even the devils, believe in Jesus.
19,
so I don't know that that's
belief alone.
That's why I feel like we're kind of deviating off the sacrifice topic and the Ebionite.
Yeah, but I mean, Jesus went to the temple. I mean, this is known stuff.
So the thing is, you brought up the cleansing of the temple, Cam, I believe, and I do want to go back to that, so it doesn't look like we're avoiding it at all. The Essenes, or that community, or that type of thinking, was anti-temple. Jesus was everything but that, right? In fact, he even called it his father's house. So that is he can't be a Essene or even a part of that sect because they were against the temple. Oh, they were against the temple.
No. I think it's a bit of a non sequitur in the sense that Jesus they weren't against the idea of a temple. They were against the temple sacrifice system. They believe you've turned my father's house into a den of thieves. The temple was always meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. And so they were against what was happening in the temple or to the temple. They believed it was a defilement of the temple.
Not by the first century. By the first century, they were almost certainly against the temple system. All of it, even the actual building. They had a temple that they had built.
Yeah. Well,
you mean
the Essenes.
The Essenes. The Essenes were definitely against the building in Jerusalem. This became even a major part of debate of where God should be worshipped in general. I mean, remember Jesus with the woman at the well. She's like, well, your people say it's in Jerusalem, a.k.a. the temple. Our father said it's in this mountain. There was a major debate, and Jesus was like, it really won't matter because I'm here. And when I'm here, I'll be worshiped because God is a spirit and will be worshiped in spirit and truth. The point is that there were different locational places of worship, and the Essenes absolutely rejected the temple in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. And Jesus said, this is my father's house.
Right. Yeah. And again, we're not saying Jesus was an Essene. We're saying Jesus emerged from this sect, from this lineage, and we actually believe he probably had a lot of differences with them.
Sure.
And that's probably why he left Qumran to go to, Palestine and preach the gospel there rather than in Qumran, because he didn't have full alignment with their beliefs.
Well, you believe Jesus was in Qumran?
No, I'm saying Jesus emerged from that sect, whether he was obviously born in Nazareth or Galilee, but his lineage clearly with the connections we've shown most likely came from that sect. Because we know he wasn't a Pharisee or a Sadducee.
Well, hold on. If that's a major point, and also the Essenes were very ascetic. They were very excluded from community and society. Jesus was all, Jesus was all in society. I mean, he was wanting crowds. He was calling for people. So I would say that Jesus had no relation at all to the Essene group. I'd say there's nothing that even in his ministry parallels except for the idea of baptisms. But the difference is Jesus wasn't baptizing people daily.
What about communalistic living, though?
Well, hold on.
Jesus clearly brought the communalistic voluntary poverty tradition, which we showed you in the Dead Sea Scrolls, to his Jerusalem community or Galilean community. He was practicing that Essenian practice, which again is unique to the Essenes. There is no other Jewish sect that practiced communalistic living.
Well, my camera's acting up. I would say that. I would say that what we're seeing is an example of the Texas sharpshooter, where you capitalize on certain parallels, but you ignore everything, because Jesus, particularly his habits concerning the Sabbath, which the Pharisees also had a great deal of concern with, and in the fact that he was willing to go out to people who were seen as ritually unclean and spiritually unclean, that would have been not just condemned by the Essenes, but they would have actually have rejected him outright for eating in tax collectors' houses, for touching people with ritually and physically uncleanliness.
What's your evidence for saying that they would reject him for that, though? How do you know they would reject him for that?
Well, they believed in these
they were obsessed with ritual purity.
Yeah, purity.
They were obsessed with. So they had very strict laws.
Billy Carson.
While Wes is coming back, I think what he's saying is there were strict laws, like the woman that was unclean with the issue of blood, grabbing his garment. That was not right. He was going up to lepers. He was healing. People were supposed to be abstaining from this. He was ceremonially breaking their laws all the time, like almost on purpose, almost antagonistic of it in this sense.
I pulled that quote up from Eusebius, who said that Jesus did not observe any of those commandments, believing they were man-made. He held the Torah was the 10 commandments.
But the point is that the Essenes, he would have had nothing to do with them, and they would have had nothing to do with him. To say that he came out of that would be a little bit unrealistic in our worldview and our perspective. Now going back to the temple, he was there for all the major. He was there for the Feast of Lights. I mean, he was there specifically for the Passovers. He was there for the Feast of Tabernacles and all this stuff.
We fully agree.
So he was obviously for it.
Yeah, let me go back to the point you made about him, because I agree he wasn't a card-carrying Essene, but there were many branches of Essenes by the first century, most notably Essenes to the south, Nazarenes to the north, and the Essenes that Philo, Josephus, and Pliny describe is almost certainly the Essenes, who at some point there was a bifurcation of the Essenes over marriage and celibacy.
Divorce.
Yeah. And so the Essenes are being described by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny, and Jesus would have been from the Nazarenes, which is more of the northern branch. So there's many sects going on. It's not just there's just one sect and Jesus came from that sect. It's way more complex than that. But the commonalities I was trying to show you guys is that these three beliefs, atonement, baptism, opposition to sacrifices, and communalistic living, are unique to the Jesus group and to the Dead Sea Scroll group.
I'm trying to figure out what happened to our friend here.
Yeah,
I get what you're saying. Other than that, I don't know what happened. But anyway, let's get into the temple part, because I don't want to keep ignoring Kam when it came to the sacrificial system here. Okay, so Jesus gets to the temple. He is there on what's called a pilgrim feast. That's why he's there. It's a pilgrim feast, which means people from all over are coming back to hometown to acknowledge the sacrificing, the festivities, the days, the preparations, all those things. So what does Jesus find when he gets there coming into Passover? This is the issue that Kam presented. He finds There's a problem. He sees people at money, exchanging money. I think Wes is coming back.
There he is.
Sorry about that.
Why'd you abandon us?
You
No,
you wicked bastard, unplugging your Wi-Fi.
Yeah, but so we're catch you up, Wes. We're
in the temple
talking about the temple. We've shadowed the doors. Okay. Pilgrimage feast. People are coming from all over the place. Jesus is angry. And by the way, I would argue that this event may have happened more than once based on the synoptics in John. I actually think it happened twice. So when we look at Jesus's attitude, he is angry with the money changers, right? He flips their table.
I think that's
and
a
I think
part
he
of
was
what
angry
he's
about
angry
the
at.
animals too.
Yeah.
And we can explain why, but go ahead.
Why would let's ask this question. Why would the animals and money changers be connected just societally? Why are they connected to begin with? What's the connection?
Because people are coming from all over. Not everyone has the ability to bring a clean animal or a right animal. Not everyone has the ability to afford it. So there needs to be a temple tax or an exchange rate that's happening so that they can get the proper animal to murder.
Well, they were going to be sacrificing these animals, and people traveling, it's pretty hard to carry an animal with you 150 miles. They didn't have horse trailers back then to just put animals in, right? So this was supposed to be a provision for these people that were traveling pilgrims to come celebrate the feast. And what the religious leaders decided to do is make merchandise off of these pilgrims instead of actually giving them provision for sacrifice. So Jesus is angry with the money changers because they're making merchandise off of animal sales, not because they're selling animals, but because they're making money off of animals. That's why he flips the table and calls them a den of thieves, which, by the way, he's quoting Jeremiah chapter 7.
Yes.
When he uses that language there. So are we all caught up?
Yeah.
Well, you would say it's a this and that because there is evidence even in the synoptics that Jesus was upset about the animals when he quotes Hosea 6:6. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And if you knew what this means, you would not have condemned the innocent. And of course, he can't be talking about the person offering the sacrifice because that's why they're offering it. They're not innocent. The priest who kills the animal can't be innocent because they're murdering an animal. He must be referring to the animals who are innocent.
And in particular, if I could just hang on your last statement, that was great, Stephen. We agree on the storytelling.
Sure.
However, as you mentioned, Jesus quotes Jeremiah 7:11.
So you're in the synoptic. You're not in John. So you're looking at the synoptic account because I believe there's two. So which one are you in right now? Are you in the synoptic or are you in the John count? Just so we're on the same page.
Yeah, the synoptic accounts. Yeah.
Okay, so which one are you specifically wanting to look in? Mark, Matthew, or Luke?
We can look in anyone.
Well, we're just looking at the Jeremiah quote.
Yeah, we're looking at the Jeremiah quote. So specifically, he's quoting Jeremiah.
Yep.
And if you look at Jeremiah 7:11, the Hebrew there is den of parits, or paritzim, I think is the plural or whatever, right? And this is one of the actual key arguments of my film Christspiracy, that the most accurate translation of that word is actually violent ones. If you look at the concordance with a sub definition of murderers, which is hence why Aaron and I are using that language, because they're not murdering. When Jesus shows up, they're not murdering anyone in the temple. They're not murdering people. They're murdering animals. That's what the bloodshed is.
Well, we have to be really careful with the linguistic adage in that, because Hebrew isn't a very nondescript language that requires context. And so there's a semantic range for all sorts of words. And so context merits what we're talking about there.
Sure.
So you could ascribe murder, but it may or may not actually mean that, in the same sense that it's the same word in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not murder. Right?
Well, the context that I would give would actually be what I like to call the ultimate Jesus remix, when he takes Isaiah and Jeremiah and squashes them together and says, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of thieves. He's mashing those together. And I truly see that in the temple, when he's speaking to particularly the leadership, I believe, and the people that are doing the money changing in the animal sacrifice, they would know that Isaiah explicitly condemns animal sacrifice a number of times in the text, as well as says, my house should be a house of prayer for all nations, and that you will not hurt nor destroy on my holy mountain. And that Hebrew word destroy there has a root that actually means to slaughter an animal, to sacrifice. So that messianic vision, which he comes to fulfill, like we talked about in Luke, when he declares this is the year of the Lord, part of that messianic vision is no more animal sacrifice. There's no slaughter in the kingdom of heaven. We don't need to slaughter and butcher God's creatures or God's creation. Let's return to the Edenic ideal or the prophetic kingdom of heaven vision of no death and no slaughter.
We can get into why the animal sacrifice is no longer needed because Hebrews answers that very, very clearly. But as it relates to the temple, do you know how the Septuagint translates the Jeremiah 7, the word that, because again, we're talking about an etymology of a word here. There are various ways that you can look at a word. It's
less days. You get into less days?
Yeah, lestes. Yeah, or lestes is the word that is the Septuagint. Right. So the Septuagint are Hebrew translators putting it into Greek. They believed the word meant thieves, not murder, because the etymology allows for multiple translations, and one could be murder, one could be violence, one could be thieves, and one could actually be a combination of all three. It could be a violent thief. In fact, it's the same word in the story of Luke's gospel. You have the story of the Good Samaritan. You have this man who's going over from Jericho. He gets jumped by robbers and thieves, and they beat him. They take his stuff. They were violent thieves. It's the same word.
Right. It is the general word. It is the general word for criminals in Hellenistic literature. It's also, in fact, right. It's used for pirates, and not necessarily in the sense of murder, but in the sense of thievery. And this is where you see within the Hellenistic context. I do have a clarifying question, because Jesus actually tells people to go make sacrifices in the temple.
We can get to that. We can get to that. But really quick, I want to. Can I say on less days?
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say on less days. That's a great point that you brought up about the man. He's actually left for dead, right? In the text, It says he's left for dead, right? So the designation for even less days, which I would argue, and I know Aaron and I on our position would probably argue, given the nature of what we were saying with the Hebrew gospel versus a potential Greek gospel, or should I say a potential Hebrew gospel, that the gospels, they're writing to a Greek audience, and they're using that word because they're writing to a Greek audience. But even taking it at face value, lestes denotes violence. It's a different word than your traditional thief. So it's implying a violent act. So it's not
necessarily.
No. Lestes in its generic form is a thief. Period.
Yeah.
Like that's
what do you think Jesus was saying when he quoted Jeremiah in the temple to Hebrew priests on a Hebrew holiday of Passover? Do you think he said lestes?
Well, I actually do, because what he's doing here is he's actually talking to the money changers. And in Luke's gospel, we'll just take Luke because you said go to any of them. He went in the temple and began to cast out them that sold therein and them that bought. That's a buyer and a seller. He's clearly interested in the usage of money, or if you would, the taking advantage of people and the reasoning behind it. So the way that he would have used the word thieves would naturally go to the buying and selling process. The animals aren't even mentioned at that point when he uses that language. He is angry with the transactions, the business transactions that are happening, because it was never supposed to be a business transaction. It was supposed to be a provision, and it turned into a business transaction. The word simply means thieves, or lestes in Greek is regularly translated thieves. It can, as I said, the Hebrew word that you were mentioning early in Jeremiah can mean thief, murderer, violent, or a combination of all. Sure. But the Septuagint translators did not feel that that word needed to be translated violent murderers, but rather thieves. They chose the word lestes, which is what Luke, Matthew, and Mark chose.
And Plutarch exclusively uses that word to refer to pirates who are kidnapping people, because Julius Caesar was kidnapped by pirates. So Plutarch uses the natural function of the word within the Hellenistic literature to only describe thieves. The violence may be implied, but the actual function of the word is that they are stealing people from land, they're taking them on boats, and then they are selling them.
Totally. I'm aware of
that
Go ahead, Aaron.
He's upset about them profiting from the temple system and the killing of the animals.
Exactly. We're saying it's both. And in the same way that you focus, particularly Stephen, on the turning of the money changers' tables, I would add, which I didn't hear in your particular storytelling because we stopped at the thieves part, but he also proceeded to free the animals.
Johnny unleashes the bulls and the goats and the doves and all that.
He lets all the bulls and goats.
So again, you said stay in the synoptics. I'm saying in the synoptics. We can get to John's account of a different, because it's a different scene. In Luke's gospel, there's nothing mentioned about the animals at all, really, other than the fact that he's
there is in Matthew and Mark.
There is Matthew, Mark. Yeah.
You said pick an account. My point is, I'm picking Luke. Why didn't Luke feel like that was important enough, unless he felt like the main point was to get into the money changers? He obviously felt like the main point of that text to share with the people was that there was dishonest gain being made on the people of God for an opportunity to help their co-laborers and family and friends actually worship properly, and they're too busy making money off them. That's Luke's perspective. He didn't even come away with an issue with the animals. It was simply the money changers. That was his entire focus.
Sure, but what the money was about was animal sacrifices. And I think our point here is that we fully believe Jesus was against sacrifices, as per the Eusebius quotes I put on the screen. And from a larger spiritual view, it's the idea that the 10 Commandments, which Jesus said was the way to eternal life, says, "Thou shalt not kill." And so we believe Jesus would have been vehemently against sacrifices. And this is especially depicted in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, in the surviving quotes that we have. Jesus is quoted as saying, "If you do not cease from offering sacrifices, the wrath of God will not cease from you." And in the Greek Gospels, that is not included, but we believe that the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew is much earlier than
What are you quoting from when you talk about the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew?
What am I quoting from?
Yeah.
The patristic quotes. We have 48 surviving quotes from the church fathers. I'm happy.
And they wrote in Hebrew?
Say again?
They wrote in the Hebrew?
No, they're quoting the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, which Jerome says he translated from Hebrew to Greek and Latin.
Okay. All right. So I think there's a miscommunication here that needs to be cleared up. What Jerome had, the Ebionites did not have. Because if you go back to the Jerome quote, Jerome saying that a Hebrew copy of Matthew was found in the library of Caesarea by a martyr named Pamphilus, who brought it back to Jerome. Once Jerome received this singular copy of the Hebrew Matthew, he mentions two groups, one of which was the Ebionites, wanted that translatable copy from Jerome. Why would they need it if they already had it? So obviously what Jerome had was not the same as what they were using. And this is where I think Epiphanius is really going to help us, because he tells us that there were actually, which by the way, again, take it from somebody who believes there was an actually Hebrew Matthew that existed before the Greek. I do believe that. But what the Ebionites were using was not that initial Matthew. The initial Matthew would have been, according to Papias, a sayings, a logia gospel. It would have been probably a collection of like the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse, the Lord's Prayer, things like that. In fact, I would argue that James is doing an exposition of the teachings of Jesus that would have had an earlier form of this Matthew that was being distributed to the church very, very early on. But what the early church fathers are saying is that Matthew had collected teachings in the Hebrew Aramaic, and that he had put together some sort of sayings gospel, which I think is the missing cue, by the way, the whole hypothetical gospel. I don't think you need it. I think we have it with Matthew's eyewitness account. I think the Greek gospel was translated later with a company of eyewitnesses with Matthew taking his work, Mark's work, and other testimony and corroborating them together. That being said, What Jerome had in his hand from Pamphilus that came from Caesarea could not be what the Ebionites were using, or they would not have asked him for a translation of it had they already had it themselves. What they were looking at was a gospel, according to Epiphanius, that was mutilated of Matthew, that they had interpolated things, they had added and removed things. Those are his words, mutilated. And he knew of a man who was a part of that group named Josephus, not to be confused with the chronicler. We're talking about a different man who was an Ebionite, and he had personal conversations with Ebionites who'd mentioned that they took John and translated it from Greek to Hebrew. Acts of the Apostles turned it into Greek to Hebrew. And he even said they used some of Matthew and mutilated a Hebrew Matthew. So it's clear what the Ebionites were using and quoting was not the same as the initial text that Matthew would have produced in Hebrew Aramaic sayings. Had they, if so, then why did they want Jerome to take what he had gotten from the library of Caesarea and give it to him if they already had it? So clearly we need to make this up, because what ended up happening is they started calling this gospel of Matthew that they had, it was also called the gospel of the Hebrews. And what I don't want to do is confuse this, because the gospel of the Hebrews and the Matthew mutilated gospel they have in Hebrew is one gospel, apparently, from what we can tell. But what the original Matthew had that was found in Caesarea is not the same as the alleged Matthew that the Ebionites were using. They're not the same, even though they had the same name. That's why I say similar doesn't mean same. That's what we need to be clear on.
I would agree to a large extent, but I think it's more so because the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew would have, like all books, eventually been changed or edited across time. The interesting thing about what Epiphanius says is that he says they mutilated the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and then he goes through the 8 quotes that he thinks are mutilations.
Yes, he does.
It's kind of funny to read, because he puts like the John the Baptist eating cakes and honey versus locusts, and he gets all angry about it. So scholars identify the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, specifically James R. Edwards in his book. And can you guys see my screen, by the way?
No.
The quotes on the screen?
No.
Oh, bummer. I'm putting the church father quotes on the screen. Epiphanius says, they, the Nazarenes, have a gospel according to Matthew, quite complete in Hebrew. Jerome says, Matthew, called Levi, composed a gospel of Christ at first published in Judea in Hebrew for the sake of the circumcision who believed. Of course, we have the Papias quote, Eusebius, Origen, and many others. And so the point we're trying to make here is that the 48 surviving quotes we have do paint a strikingly different version of Jesus in many ways than the Greek Gospels do, specifically when it comes to animal sacrifices.
It's condemned. Because it's condemned.
And that's what I'm saying.
It wasn't condemned for a very long time. The church fathers actually quote from the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew in reference to the Greek Gospels often in their commentaries, and they speak very highly of it up until around the 3rd century. And then as they get associated with the Ebionites, they start to condemn it as
no. This is what I'm trying to say. We got to look at this differently, because both documents are given the same name, right? Matthew's name is alleged to whatever the Ebionites are using.
The same document adapted in a different document, though, right? Like the source text could have been that original gospel written by Matthew in Hebrew.
The source text.
That's not what the patristics are saying.
The patristics are telling us that Matthew's gospel, and I mean, I can actually pull up some of the quotes of this if I need to. They're actually telling us that, because you're mentioning Jerome, Origen, all them. By the way, again, I affirm that there is a Hebrew gospel, but there are also church fathers that tell us that it was translated into Greek by others. In fact, the names that would have been associated with the translation are James, John, and Barnabas, and a few others that the church fathers are saying were a part of some sort of corporate work where the Greek gospel was almost like a headquarters gospel. Think about this from the perspective, what good is if Matthew is legitimately writing down Jesus's teachings in Hebrew, Aramaic, and just a combination, nobody in the Greek world can read that to continue to put a gospel out there in Hebrew and Aramaic, because the trade language of the world was
They may not
Greek.
have been interested in the Greek world at that point, though.
No, early on they were not.
They wrote it for the Jews in particular.
Right. Well, exactly. So once the gospel went out of Jerusalem, Judea, which was Jesus's intention, to Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth, and to go into all nations, a Hebrew Aramaic gospel does no good. It's incomplete, and it actually doesn't do anything. At this point, Mark's gospel is circulating.
That really doesn't have much to do with our point, though. Our
yes,
point
it
here
does.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have anything to do with our
Absolutely
faith.
does, because
I can
you're
tell you
trying
why.
to. No, because you're trying to say that the Matthew that the Ebionites is using is the same Matthew that these church fathers are talking about, and it's not. They're condemning the Matthew
That's
you're
not what I'm
talking
saying.
about.
That's not what I'm saying.
What are you saying then? You said they're quoting it.
Irenaeus says that Matthew wrote the Hebrew gospel in Hebrew when Peter and Paul were preaching
We're
at
in
Rome.
Rome. Yes.
So that puts it
Which is
around
a different thing than
50
the
AD?
citations of the Hebrew Matthew that you're
That
referring
puts it in the 60s.
60s, sure. So
Early
the point
60s,
is
late
that
50s.
when these same church fathers then quote from it, they quote Jesus as being written opposing sacrifices, and notwithstanding that the Hebrew gospel of Matthew is in first person in the quotes that they give, whereas the Greek gospels are all in third person, which is why I don't think that they're eyewitness accounts at all. I don't think any of the disciples could have written in sophisticated Koine Greek documents like the New Testament gospels are. So we believe
there's
that
no
the
such
Hebrew gospel
there's no
of
such thing as
Matthew-
sophisticated Koine Greek.
Oh,
Koine Greek is
absolutely there is.
unsophisticated by definition.
Oh my gosh, dude, the Greek New Testament documents are highly intelligent. They're written by highly intelligent, educated Greek scribes. They're not
with
written
all due
by
respect,
Jewish peasants who have some working Greek.
With all due respect, that indicates that you are not able to read Greek fluently, because there are levels of Koine Greek in terms of the fact that Hebrews and Luke and Romans are more sophisticated, but Koine by its definition is simple. And that's when you compare something like Plutarch or Xenophon to something even like Luke or Hebrews, which is the most sophisticated Greek in the New Testament. It is still far, far more simple. And so Koine by its definition is simple because it's common.
Sure. But what I mean is you would agree that the New Testament Gospels were written by intelligent Greek-speaking scribes, Greek-trained scribes.
Well, but this is not unusual in the fact that all biographies in the ancient world, if we look 150 years before Jesus and 150 years after Jesus, almost every gospel is written either anonymously or in the third person. In fact, all of Plutarch's documents are written in the third person. And most, even Josephus writes in the third person.
Especially when he's in war. Yeah.
And so this is a common parlance use within ancient biographical writing. So yeah. So and this would have been assumed to be what you would do if you were an eyewitness. You would write in black. Plutarch describes himself as a good soldier in the third person.
Yeah, Josephus says the same thing in the wars. And
there's also first-person documents written as well, right?
That's the difference between an autobiography and a biography. When they're writing biographies, they go to the third person. The Gospels are biographies.
In fact, I'm only aware of two that don't do that are formally identified with the author identifying themselves within the text. And that would be the writing of Peregrinus, the passing of Peregrinus, and I'm blanking on the other one. But there are significant analyses of these within ancient biographical literature, and third person was the standard. So we can't point to that as saying non-eyewitness, because you would have to discount close to 300 biographical sources, all of Plutarch, all of the 60 biographies that he writes in the ancient world, which are the standard for ancient biographical literature in the ancient world. You would have to dismiss them.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that just because they're in third person, there's no way they were first person accounts. I'm saying my reasoning for believing they're not first person accounts or eyewitness accounts by the disciples is we don't have any record of anyone stating, Matthew wrote the Greek Matthew. We only have church fathers overwhelmingly stating that Matthew the disciple wrote the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, which is in the first person and does have Jesus opposing sacrifices.
The quote that they have from this, again, if you're putting together an actual biographical account, which is exactly what Epiphanius and Theophylact and others are saying. By the way, they attribute John to being one of the translators of the Gospel of Matthew in producing it, because it actually was sent from Jerusalem. If Jerusalem is the headquarters along with Antioch, there's this main line going out. If you're going to send a gospel that makes it to the entirety of the world, it needs to be sent in Greek. And what Matthew would have collected would have been just summaries or statements or teachings of Jesus. It would not have been an actual biographical work. It needed completion. So it's using Mark. Multiple places Matthew is clearly borrowing from Mark. It also has its own material coming into the equation. You can tell there's a multiplicity of ideas and statements and teachings and lineage, Jesus's lineage coming into it. But again, what Epiphanius is saying about the Matthew account, which he attributes apparently to John being a part of the translation committee, was sent from Jerusalem, published from Jerusalem. We find this also in other places. That Barnabas was buried with a copy of Matthew that he had personally worked on and helped translate when he was buried in Cyprus. So we also have church fathers telling us multiple places that the Gospel of Matthew had to make it in Greek, and they're trying to tell us people that were a part of the translating process. By the time Jerome is around and he's getting this Matthew Gospel from the Library of Caesarea, he is saying that it's something the Ebionites want, which means it's something they don't have. And what we're trying to say is, yes, there was an original publication of Essene's Gospel in Matthew that was incomplete and needed fuller and grander writing. And it took a group in Jerusalem to produce that with a corroboration of Mark, because he's clearly using Mark, his own unique material, which some called the Matthean material. And then there's also even, it seems like maybe some influence from people like James, because he's also attributed to this as well, because Athanasius himself, Athanasius of Alexandria, attributes Matthew to James, the brother of Jesus, being a part of the translation. That would make sense how the lineage came into it, because he would have had it. So maybe James and John and Barnabas and Matthew and these people that are all listed were in Jerusalem producing a gospel, moved it to Greek. The Hebrew form would become insignificant because now you have a grander and a better text that is universal. But there was apparently still some left of it, so much that it was not in distribution that somebody had to go find the dusty shelves of Caesarea's library to even find a copy. The Ebionites are all over this thing. They want it. Well, if they already have it, then why do they want it? The point is what they had was not the same form of the Hebrew Matthew that was in the library of Caesarea. That's what I'm trying to say. And that's why Epiphanius can praise the Hebrew Matthew, because it was in a form that was actually from Matthew, and actually reject a mutilated form of it that was being used by the Ebionites.
That's our position as well, is that it was an edited version from 300 to 400s AD. We have Eusebius, Epiphanius, and I think Jerome as well, all saying that the Ebionites use only the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And when Epiphanius breaks down the changes that they made to it in 8 different quotes that he references, they're very minor quotes that he kind of makes a big deal about. So it may have been a slightly edited version. There may have been multiple versions of it at that point, 4 centuries later. But again, the main point here is that the church fathers overwhelmingly agree that the first gospel account was written by the disciple Matthew in Hebrew, and it has Jesus opposing sacrifices.
But that wasn't their standard gospel, was it? That wasn't the Hebrew Matthew is not their standard gospel. They clearly didn't even have access to it. Jerome didn't even have access to it.
When you say they, do you mean Ebionites or?
The patristics.
Fathers, the patristics that you're talking
are
about.
using the Greek.
The standard gospel of Matthew that they were using in their churches, teaching and preaching from, was the Greek. They didn't even have access to the Hebrew. They only knew of its existence almost in a legendary form, so that when Jerome got a copy, it was like, oh, wow, there's one.
And they did not see it. They did not see it in competition. No. So whatever they're referring to with the Hebrew gospel is in full conjunction and agreement with the Greek that they're using, which affirms things like, the Jesus referring to the temple as his father's house, or telling lepers in Luke 5:14 to go and actually do the offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for the cleansing.
Mm-hmm. So do you guys want to end with the topic of sacrifice as it pertains to Jesus and Paul?
I mean, if you want, that's totally fine.
Yeah, I think we'd love to just get into that with you guys, because if we're bringing one question to this debate, and I've really enjoyed the conversation thus far, it's been great. But our main question would be, why does the omnipotent Lord of the universe need to ritually, violently butcher something, animal or human, to forgive sins? Especially when the Old Testament is rife with passages, again, the 2 atonement doctrines we mentioned in our thesis, The Old Testament is full of passages that say God forgives anybody who repents with a humble heart, and says he casts your sins as far as the east is from the west, remembers them no more, throws them to the bottom of the ocean floor. So we're a little confused on that belief system in, I guess, Protestant Christianity, that why would God need a blood sacrifice if he has a repentant heart already?
Because forgiveness is costly. Forgiveness always costs something.
The innocent.
And that,
So God can
yeah,
be costed something?
yes, well, this is the issue, and this is what divides historical biblical Christianity from something like Islam, whereas Islam, the God of Islam, is arbitrary. He forgives randomly, but he does so at the expense of his justice. Justice must be fulfilled, and that's why you see the sacrificial system set up in that there must be a penalty. People need to realize that if I, back my car into Anton's car, and mine's a crappy Nissan and his is a Tesla, and I don't have my insurance up to date, and he says, you know what, Wes, you're a good guy, I forgive you, there's still a cost. The cost is just on him, it's just not on me. So the forgiveness comes at a cost. And so the gospel message is entirely that God's justice must be completed in order to be fulfilled for the law. God doesn't just wink at sin. He must look at sin.
We don't think God winks at sin either.
So how is God's justice fulfilled?
The analogy you're painting, Wes, would mean that when you bumped into Stephen's car, he'd have to go offer an animal sacrifice rather than pay for
all
the
I'm
car.
saying is by the analogy that it's costly, that it costs something.
Cost something to who, though?
So sin is not just an oops. Sin is not just me bumping my car
We agree.
into Anton. Sin is me purposefully burning Anton's car and his house and his brother who lives with him down to the ground and wanting to purposefully do that. And so the fact is that forgiveness is costly all the time. And so when Jesus uses the ransom language, that the Son of Man has come to be a ransom for many, it's the exact same language that the Septuagint uses when it's talking about sin sacrifice. And when Jesus establishes the new covenant in his blood, he uses that language. He's referring to, at the Passover meal, the blood that is of the sacrificial lamb that is then put on the lintel of the door in order that the angel of death passes over. It's inherently hearkening to the fact that this forgiveness has a cost, and the cost is something that people need to take seriously. And Jesus understands this. This is why he is agonizing in the Garden of Gethsemane, because he knows that it's not just the physical pain that he's going to go through, but it is the eternal wrath of the Father that's going to be poured on him.
Yeah, that's the ontological question we're asking. Is, to us, ontology is the most important reference frame when we're dealing with metaphysics. We have to be consistent with what we say about the nature of God. And so I'm sure you guys believe God is omnipotent, omniscient, these kinds of things. Would you agree?
Yeah, of course.
So if God is omnipotent, meaning God has all power, then why does God need something, let alone murder and bloodshed, to offset sin? Is there a metaphysical debt that incurs upon God when we sin?
Well, the sacrifice of Christ is not murder. He says, no one takes my life of me. I give it of my own accord.
I lay it down.
So he purposefully goes. And that's why I said earlier at the beginning of this, that it's the gospel is a Trinitarian thing, essentially, because the Father sending the Son, who is giving himself, and then the empowerment of the believers in the Holy Spirit. So Jesus is not going unwillingly. He knows exactly what he's stepping into.
You don't think he was?
You don't think he was?
Right. So it's not murder. Jesus gives himself.
Well, what you're saying is God allowed Jesus to be murdered by other people, which is still
Jesus
murder.
is God. So
Jesus
it's the eternal
was murdered
plan
on the cross.
Right? Yeah. So
why did God
need to let Jesus I have the
murdered?
power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it again. He's in full control of what happens. And he even once he tells Pilate that, Pilate almost tries to get Jesus out of it. It's like, okay, let's let this guy alone. He almost feared dealing with Jesus a little bit. His wife had bad dreams about it. I mean, Jesus was in complete control of his death and his life. Like, it wasn't just like God let it happen. He let it happen.
I'll put it this way. When Jesus is teaching us things like forgive 70 times 7, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, love your enemies, bless those who persecute you. If you don't forgive, you can't be forgiven. Do you think Jesus was giving us a different rule set that God apparently doesn't have to follow? God can forgive. God has to forgive through murder in some form, whether animal or Jesus. But Jesus says, you guys just forgive each other. Why can't God just forgive when someone repents?
Well, you forgive on the same basis of, like, you are not given the power to forgive sins. That's why in Mark 2, when they say no one can forgive sins but God, Jesus answers, why does this fellow talk like, right? They say, why does this fellow talk like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And
Correct.
Jesus' response is, I can forgive sins because I am Yahweh.
Did Jesus say that?
Well, that's what's implied, and that's why the Pharisees get so mad at him.
I mean, I don't think it is, though. Jesus didn't say that.
That no one can forgive sins but God alone. He doesn't say, "Oh, I'm not actually."
Well, I can forgive sins because I'm Yahweh. That's not what Jesus said.
But he doesn't
Jesus
disagree
says,
with them.
if you forgive others, God will forgive you. What you give out is what you get back. So it's always God that atones for sin, of course. But he's saying, if you don't forgive your brother, your Heavenly Father can't forgive you. That's the gospel of Jesus.
Right, but it's done secondarily on the fact that you're not actually forgiving sins. You are forgiving your brother for the wrongdoing.
You're forgiving
but it is
offenses.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're
By the
forgiving
way,
offenses.
That was taught in the
Yeah.
Old Testament too. I mean, that was taught with a sacrificial system. That's not a new thing that Jesus just invented. Like, he's actually reiterating the heartbeat of the law.
Correct. We believe Jesus was teaching what the Old Testament teaches, which is that God forgives anyone who repents. Jesus didn't say forgiveness is secondary. Forgiveness was primary in Jesus' gospel.
Yeah, but the fact is, how does God forgive? Does God forgive because he just erases his law? Does God break his own law?
No, forgiveness is part of the law, Wes.
Right. And
Forgiveness
how is that
the law.
fulfilled?
If
So
you
where's
hold,
the justice?
If you hold something against someone, the law holds that thing against you.
Could I ask something on this topic? And sorry earlier too if I was like butting. It's because I haven't gotten to get too many words in, so I'm like fighting for it. You guys are crushing it though. When you say there's a cost, is that cost blood?
The blood is a symbol of the actual penalty. I mean,
so okay. On that, because we just went into Old Testament, let's just stay there for a second, and we can get to Jesus, and Jesus is the cross in a minute. But
so we have both Leviticus 17 saying that for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by life. And then the author of Hebrews plays on this when he says, indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins.
Correct. And we believe that those were the passages added by the lying pens of the scribes per Jeremiah 8:8, which Jesus rejected per Eusebius. Jesus did not participate or require sacrifices. And we even see this in the New Testament of him opposing sacrifices, quoting
You're
Hosea.
saying that was added? You're saying it was added like it's an interpolation?
Yes.
Based on what manuscripts?
Based on what manuscripts?
What manuscripts?
We're saying Jeremiah said it.
What manuscripts of Leviticus?
Let Aaron answer.
Well, I just want to add something to that because I want to get to that. We can talk about that. But let's just take Leviticus at face value with the quote you just gave, Wes. What about Leviticus 5:11? If you're poor, do you have to give blood? Do you have to sacrifice an animal?
Yeah, and that's why when Jesus' family goes at the beginning of Luke's gospel, they buy a dove for pennies, because the fact is that if there were provisions made for people who are not of wealthy status in order to still make the sacrifices, in order to point to, and this is the whole point of the author of Hebrews, is he's saying these things are pointing to the greater fulfillment. These are shadows of the things to come. So that sacrificial system is done away because Christ is the ultimate sacrifice. But we see the provisions made for the poor for the fact that there needs to be a sign of the penalty of the sin that is done, both for the nation of Israel and the nations around.
By the way, that's why the temple money changers had their tables flipped, because they were supposed to be taking cheap animals that were used for sacrifice and making expensive merchandise off of them. Yeah. And Jesus's family was a poor family, and they brought the doves just as Leviticus 5 instructed. And I mean, would you say Mary and Joseph are wrong?
But that's the thing is, you're not. Can you read Leviticus 5 again? 5:11?
No, hold on. Answer the question. Was Jesus's parents, who apparently were a part of the Essene group of some sort, wrong for bringing these doves to the temple?
we can get to that in a minute, but I had a previous question first about Genesis 5:11. I'm not trying to be mean. I just really
It's 17:11. Yeah.
You're talking about Leviticus 17?
No, I'm talking about Leviticus 5:11. If you cannot afford to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, you may bring 2 quarts of choice flour for your sin offering. No blood.
Right, but it's still an offering, and the fact is that there's offering, and it's seen as inferior. It's seen as inferior in Leviticus.
Sure, but this is kind of what I'm aware right now that I'm making a bit of a jump, but it wouldn't be as much of a jump if in a moment we could lay out our whole again our thesis of the Nazarenes and the Ebionites, but maybe this is why blessed are the poor. They don't even need. It's not even required.
Poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit.
It's not blessed are the poor. It's not blessed as the poor. It's the poor in spirit.
In Matthew, it's poor, and in Luke, it's poor in spirit.
Yeah,
both are poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit in Matthew. Blessed
sure?
Are the poor. I'm 100% sure.
Is it Mark that's blessed are the poor?
No, there's the Sermon on the Plain, the Sermon on the Mount. There's
only Luke and Matthew record this, and it explicit. I mean, we could pull it up. I mean, I don't want you to take our word for it. I mean, I'll pull it up real quick for it.
Yeah.
My only point there was that Leviticus 5:11 indicates that an animal doesn't need to be slaughtered for.
Oh, in Luke, it's blessed are you poor. In Matthew, it's poor in spirit.
Luke 6:20. Blessed are the poor in spirit.
In Luke. Maybe the translation's different then. I have NIV. It says, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God.
Yeah. So if we go to the Greek, it says, blessed are
not that this poor. Matters, but interesting point.
So I think it does come back to it. If Jesus' family is then breaking what Jesus later condemns, then Mary and Joseph are... especially if they're part of this group, then are they not obeying the rules of this group, or are they committing sin?
Well, I would say 2 particular things. One is that if we take it at face value, it's Mary and Joseph. It's not Jesus. Maybe he learned something by this experience, and also, placing it within the context of the Nazarene Ebionite movement that we're talking about. Also, Aaron, I don't know if you want to get into any of this with Luke and Luke is trying to present that story is not in Mark, is it?
Patoi toi
it's only in Luke.
Pneumate is the phrase in Matthew. So yes, it is poor in spirit.
Yeah. So I want to go back to this because Jesus actually tells lepers to go and make sacrifices. How would you interpret that?
Wait. Hold on. Before we go to that, Wes, hold on. We were talking about Mary and Joseph. They brought doves. Okay. I think we all agree with that, right? They brought doves at Jesus, with Jesus there, right?
Well,
they brought doves for sacrifice.
That's what Luke says, yeah.
That's what Luke says, yeah.
Okay, so obviously they were taking... So if you're saying that Jesus grew up with an Essene sect, that was his sect.
No, those were his people. With the Essene sect.
Or a sect of the Essenes.
That was his lineage in some form or fashion.
Okay, well, obviously not from Joseph and Mary, right? If they're taking doves to be killed in the temple.
I mean, they could have converted back to Orthodoxy for all we know. There's a lot of explanations for that. It might not even be a historical fact for all we know.
I think you're continuing to make our point, gentlemen, and I appreciate the conversation, is that it takes a lot of work to attach Jesus to this group, because we have sign after sign after sign that they are not at all involved with these groups.
No,
it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of work.
Just because it says his parents offered a pigeon doesn't mean that they actually did. Number one. Number two, it doesn't mean they had no affiliation with the Essenes. To Wes's question about why does Jesus tell the leper to go offer the sacrifice in Matthew, the penalty for not doing so is ostracization from the community. And so if Jesus heals a leper who's been ostracized, he's probably going to say, hey, man, if you want to be back in the community, you got to do what the priest demands you to do.
Also, so Jesus is compromising his religious and moral values for the sake of culture. Is that what you're saying?
That's what it sounds like.
I see it similarly to the woman in adultery. He doesn't literally want the person to actually be stoned, does it? But he's telling them, does the guy actually go offer a sacrifice? It says he didn't. It says Jesus told him to go and tell no one. And to actually, it says to present to the
And
priest.
in Luke, he heals 10 lepers at once and doesn't tell any of them to go offer the sacrifice. He just says, go show yourself to the priest.
Right, but the fact that Jesus tells people to sacrifice compromises your position in general.
No.
If Jesus is against temple sacrifice,
He's against his own teaching.
and then he's compromising his moral values because society wants him to.
Again, I'll explain our point. Where we disagree is that if Jesus has the compassion to heal this leper who's been ostracized from the Jewish community, and he heals him, well, what good is him healing him if he's still ostracized from the community? He would not have been allowed to go back into the community without offering the sacrifice.
Shouldn't he have joined Jesus's group then that was also ostracized then?
Well,
shouldn't he just follow
he was
his group?
good for his group. Jesus didn't just ask anybody to join his group. He had very specific criteria he looked for, most notably a humble, repentant heart. And
So
faith.
Did that guy not fit the criteria to be one of his disciples to follow his group?
I don't know. I wasn't there.
So
he didn't invite
He
him.
doesn't invite him like he invites other people.
do we have any other examples of Jesus compromising his moral and religious values in order to make people fit in?
It's not a compromise. It's understanding the culture of the day you live in. This guy would have not been allowed back in the community, so it would have been no benefit to him to be healed.
So Jesus will overturn the tables because he's mad at the sacrificial system, but he will tell a random leper that it's okay to go to the temple and sacrifice because he won't be accepted within.
Well, can
Absolutely,
I add to,
because he's opposing the temple system when he goes into the temple and the priestly class and their corruption of the temple. This is a leper on the street who he loves and has compassion for, and he wants the guy to be integrated back into Jewish society.
So
Could
that
I-
guy should
could I
that
add
guy
to-
should make sure that he is compromising what Jesus holds as moral authority in order to be accepted within the temple system?
That guy should make sure he's compromising what?
Well, if Jesus is so against sacrifices that he's willing to
die for
go
it?
into the temple and upturn the whole religious system, but when he goes out into society, he's actually telling people it's not that big of a deal. You actually need to.
No, he didn't tell anybody that. The Bible doesn't say that. He healed the man of leprosy. And by the way,
Correct.
this is the Gospel of Matthew, which we know is a highly Judaized.
No, this is Luke.
Oh, you're quoting
I'm
from
looking.
Luke?
Yeah.
It's in Matthew.
I'm looking at
too, though,
Luke.
right?
Wait, I want to
Right,
go back
but
to
I'm-
what Aaron. I want to go back to what Aaron said about that he never told them to give a sacrifice. The 10 lepers, he told them to show themselves the priest. Now, Aaron, I think you know that he's telling them to follow Leviticus chapter number 14 there when a leper is healed, and that actually does include, because the first thing has to be done is you have to offer 2 live clean birds with cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop. That's chapter 14, verse 4 through 7.
I'm pointing out the discongruency between Matthew and Luke, where in Matthew, he does say, go offer the sacrifice to the man he heals.
No,
these are two different stories. Hold on. These are two different stories.
There's the 10 lepers and the 1 leper.
But
you're conflating them.
You're
conflating them because in Matthew, the sacrifice is assumed because Jesus is telling them to go obey the laws of Moses. In Luke, he's more specific and he says, go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing as Moses commanded for a proof.
That's
so
Leviticus 14.
In both, they're assumed that the sacrifice is actually taking place. In one, it's overtly stated, and in the other, there is no way that Jesus would have said, go do this, and it would not have been assumed that he was actually following Leviticus. In both instances, if we're going to say that Jesus is against sacrifice, Jesus is fundamentally compromising that in order to say, well, you just have to get along within society. So go make this sacrifice because I know I'm really against that, but actually, I want you to fit into society.
Could I add some perspective on that? So you mentioned earlier, actually, the woman with the blood condition. He doesn't tell her to go do a sacrifice, and the blood condition actually does require a sacrifice. He says nothing about even going to a priest, if I remember correctly. But the point that I would make is that if Jesus is telling him, and again, we're saying that these accounts are accurate too. We can get to another chat about that in a little while, but let's take them at face value. Because, by the way, I love the Bible. I just want to reinstate that. I know Aaron does too. We love the Bible. We read the Bible all day long. Not all day long, but a lot of the time. I know you guys do. We're big fans of the Bible. Everybody should read the Bible.
I think though, you read it in a bit of isolation.
The point that I wanted to make was that the guy doesn't go offer the sacrifice though. So if Jesus is, the man that we all believe and say that he is, does he know that this guy isn't even going to do it? So that's one question that I would have. Similar to Jesus tells all the Pharisees to stone the adulterous woman. What if they actually did it?
No, it's a textual variant. It's not part
Well,
of the original of the Gospel of John.
let's
You
just
don't believe that that's inspired?
You don't believe
not
that's
John
No.
7:53 through 8:11 did not show up till the 5th century.
Yeah.
But I can, and as far as the
But
Greek tradition is shown,
I think at best here, guys, we're arguing that there's a contradiction in the narrative because
Yeah.
Jesus clearly does condemn sacrifices over and over, quoting Hosea 6:6 twice, which is the most anti-sacrifice passage in the Old Testament.
Well, hold on. Well, the contradiction that I'm sorry, guys, Kam is trying to point out is the woman with the issue of blood and saying that there was supposed to be, and I think you're talking about Luke 15. It's either 15 or 16, one of those. I think it's 15. That situation was a prescriptive sacrifice after a woman's 7-day and 8-day. The woman that Jesus healed was 12 years into bleeding. She didn't even fit the criteria for that Levitical sacrifice. So naturally, he would not have told her to go offer the sacrifice of Leviticus 15 because her situation and circumstance didn't even fit the criteria for Leviticus 15. She was beyond 7 and 8 days. She was 12 years into her bleeding.
Does Leviticus say, though, that if you're beyond that, you don't offer a sacrifice?
Why does it need to say anything beyond it other than this is the standard for a woman who goes through her monthly cycle? There doesn't need to be an exception rule put in Leviticus.
Because the Jews were so hyper obsessed with ritual purification. If a woman has the issue of blood for 12 years, she would have been extremely unclean and definitely needed to offer a sacrifice. If a woman at 7 days would have needed to offer it.
I'm not saying that she did or did not. I'm not even saying that she didn't need to based on their standard of the day. I'm saying the prescription of the sacrifice that Kam was referring to in Leviticus 15 is a monthly cycle for a woman in day 7 and day 8, which is outside of her realm of even her diagnosis. She has a disease issue. This is different.
There wouldn't be a law for an extremely rare disease like the woman had with the issue of blood.
Right. So in that sense, this does not apply. So it's a different situation, whereas we have a direct causation in instances where Jesus is referring to something that Levitical law does prescribe. And when it does prescribe it, he says, go offer sacrifice. Where it doesn't prescribe it, because it's outside of the statute of limitations of what we see within the Levitical law, he gives a different prescription because it's not dealing with a woman's menstrual cycle. It's dealing with a disease.
But I think that's where we disagree, is there wasn't a prohibition on the passage. The passage doesn't say if you're bleeding past 7 or 8 days, then don't offer the sacrifice.
No, yes, it does. It says after the 8th day, you're supposed to do it. She's past the 8th day. She's continually past the 8th
day. She definitely applies to that law then. If she's 12 years, that's way past 8 days.
No, because they would have still seen a disease outside of someone's menstrual cycle. This is not. This
isn't her monthly cycle. This is a disease that's beyond that.
Well, it's her monthly cycle never stops, is what the disease is.
No, it's not. She's treated as a diseased person, not as a ritually unclean person.
And we see that in Luke's language.
The disease is ritually unclean, though.
Can I ask a clarifying question really quick? Isn't Jesus above the law because he's God?
No.
Here's what Jesus is doing. All the extras that I think Aaron is referring to, he's doing away with, and he's almost antagonistic about it. This is the problem, that many of the Jewish groups were going above and beyond what the law required, like with the woman here. Another thing, let's just say the story of the woman caught in adultery belongs. Let's just say it belongs. The law requires that both the male and the female be brought before the tribunal, and they were not. Where was the man that she supposedly was caught in the very act of adultery with? Let's just say John wrote it. Let's say it belongs. Let's say it really happened. There should have been. Why would Jesus go along with this verdict when they weren't even following the law? They were seeking to trap him. They didn't bring the man. By the law of Moses, the woman and the man that were both caught in the act of adultery were supposed to be brought before the tribunal, and they only brought the woman. So why would Jesus play into this? So again, here's another example where the Jewish people were picking and choosing, manipulating the laws and instruction, and Jesus wasn't buying it, and he wasn't about to go into this fundamentalist view of the Jewish law where they were neglecting, as Jesus said, you've neglected the weightier matters of the law. You started tithing mint and curcumin and all these things.
Piety,
right? So Jesus wanted to get to the heart of the law, But
Yes,
it doesn't
we
mean
agree.
he dysfunctionally removed all the practical things that God required in him either. It means that if your heart is not with the sacrifice, or your heart is not with the idea of loving God and loving your neighbor, then you're doing it all for naught to begin with. Jesus wanted to get at the spirit of the law, not just the letter. He's thinking
Yeah.
that it's both.
That is our position for sure. We don't think Jesus like fully rejected any man-made ritual law. There probably was common practices that he accepted that were these are useful and don't wear two types of cloth and this and that. We're just saying Jesus didn't see those as given by God and saw that, as you said, Stephen, that the Pharisees were abusing those ritual laws and were neglecting the weightier matters.
Well,
Oh,
we agree
no,
with that, but sacrifices weren't one of them. But go
Well,
ahead,
that's where
Wes.
we differ. That's where we differ. Just
Well, that's why. So the sacrificial system ended on Good Friday, but prior to that, all of the sacrifices were still in effect, which is why Jesus tells people to go sacrifice.
One person.
But
no,
one,
we just mentioned 10 lepers that had to go show
He didn't
themselves
tell
to
them
the
to offer a
priest.
sacrifice.
He
it would have
said, go to
been,
the priest.
Show
implied.
yourself to the priest.
There's no way that they would have gone to the priest in that situation and not made a sacrifice. There would have been no reason.
The priest
other
wouldn't have
to-
done it. The priest wouldn't have acknowledged it if he didn't perform Leviticus 14 for those guys.
But I'm saying that it paints a different picture of how Jesus may have seen sacrifice. He may have been in Luke with the 10 lepers,
But if
he may have
there's
been
one
so against it that
instance,
he said, show yourself to the priest, but don't offer the sacrifice. And then in the other narrative, he does say the sacrifice.
if there's one instance, it invalidates your position.
This is the problem with the synoptics and the canonical gospels in general, is there's many, many narrative conflictions like this. And so it's hard to parse out what is history from what is narrative.
Only if you're reading your interpretation onto the text, you don't want there to be sacrifices.
No, he
So
doesn't say offer a sacrifice in that passage. That's all I'm
he
saying.
does. He says offer a sacrifice.
No, the 10 lepers.
But there would have been no reason to go to the priest other than offering a sacrifice.
But
It would have been like saying
That's
it
the
would have been like
prescription of
going to the
Leviticus
passport
14.
office. If Stephen said you need to fly tomorrow, go to the passport office, right? If I went to the passport office and I just stood in front of the clerk would have said, what are you doing here? Right? I need to apply for a passport. So it's implied that the application for the passport is needed to be done because that is the exact prescription of what the purpose of going to the passport office is. So, and in Luke 5, he does say, go to the priest. It's very specific. Hirai ke, presentake, peritu, kathoristum sothmu, soi, kathos, right? There's a commanding. It's prosetaxen muses, as was commanded by Moses.
But again, what do you guys do? Because all we're doing is pointing out a contradiction as far as I'm concerned. What do you do? I'm saying
there's no
quoting Hosea 6:6 twice. I desire mercy, not sacrifice.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's not a critique on sacrifice. It's a critique on sacrifices that are useless.
So
it
let's
absolutely is a critique on sacrifices.
So let's say it is a contradiction, which we don't think it is. Let's just say it is. Even if it's a contradiction, then there's no point in trying to use Jesus as an advocate to get away with sacrifices. Because if it's a contradiction, you have to make a choice here. Which one's wrong, and by what criteria do you decide that's wrong? What manuscript tradition you go to say this one is right and this one is wrong? This version of Jesus is right. This version of Jesus is wrong. Even if it's a contradiction, he is clearly a walking contradiction that can't be discovered and can't be, realized or adapted to. Therefore, Jesus is not a good person for your arguments that would advocate for the lack of sacrifices, or that he was trying to do something for animals. He can't be your guy. He's automatically eliminated just from his walking contradiction.
So that's where we would disagree, is that there is overwhelmingly more evidence Jesus was against sacrifices than for them. And I understand your guys' point, and we can agree to disagree that in the passage in Luke 5, he doesn't say offer the sacrifice. He only tells one person, technically speaking, to offer the sacrifice.
And they don't do it.
And they offer all these other pieces of evidence, quoting Hosea 6:6 twice. And I pulled up the quote from Eusebius, who says Jesus did not participate or require sacrifices. And again, Eusebius has documents we don't have today to know more accurately what Jesus's attitude was on sacrifices.
No, that wasn't Eusebius's opinion. That was Eusebius quoting other things. You even said that in your opening presentation. These guys are quoting other documents. They're not saying they agree with it.
They might be getting these ideas from other documents we don't have.
But
that's not what they're
definitively saying about Jesus did not require or participate in sacrifices, we can assume he may have been working from a document we don't have today, like Eusebius or some other document.
But that's an absence of evidence. That's an argument from silence. And
It's
what
not.
we
It's
do
the
know,
point is Eusebius says it.
He didn't say he
Where
believed it.
would
He's
he have gotten that
reporting
idea
it.
from?
Well, we've already seen other groups that believe that. We've already been discussing it, that were mentioned by Epiphanius. We've talked about Jerome. That's not because they personally believed it, nor did Eusebius for that matter. They're just reporting that there were groups, there were documents and statements that made these claims. It doesn't mean they're affirming and agreeing. Eusebius also said that Jesus wrote a letter to the king of King Akbar over there, who was sick, and sent a healer later. But he's just reporting what he has. He's not saying he agrees with it and that he affirms it. There's a lot of things that are put in the writings of these guys that are just telling you what was being talked about and discussed and debated in that time. They're not taking a position. In fact, when they do take a position on this issue, they condemn that side of it. They do not affirm it. They actually condemn it and say that these are insertions and corruptions.
I would encourage you to read the proof of gospel, the 1.10 and 3.3, because the context is clear. Eusebius is saying he doesn't think Jesus required or offered sacrifices. And this goes back to our point that Jesus and the sect he emerged from were against sacrifices because the 10 Commandments say, thou shalt not murder. And God is a God of life.
No, it doesn't
not a God
say
of death.
Right. But the whole sacrificial system is not seen as murder.
I'm saying Jesus saw it as murder.
What about Isaiah 66:3? To kill an ox is like killing a man.
That's part of the penalty of things that go back to the Levitical law. What was the point of killing it? This is what Wes just asked. Sacrifice is not seen the same way. You're confusing.
According to one sect of Judaism, yes.
No, the book of Proverbs even says that somebody that doesn't take care of their donkey is a horrible person, right? I mean, like, we are supposed to take care of the animals, but what you're conflating, and I think, Wes, I don't want to speak for you, what he was pointing is that sacrifice is not in the same category as just brutally beating an animal or brutally killing an animal without cause, like just for sport.
How is it not? What's the difference?
Well,
let me ask you this. Can I ask you really quickly? And I do want to get, because you asked a really good question. I think it was you, Wes, that said, or maybe it was Stephen, that said, what is your methodology to come to these conclusions about some of these particular things? And again, if we had more, I wish we had another hour to talk about it, because the evidence from beginning to end, including the scripture, the canonical scripture itself, I think paints a very clear picture where phrases or stories like the Luke one that we're hanging on come into context to understand if there is a contradiction, which one is the contradiction. But what I would say is, before we even get into that, which I would love to do, how do you believe Jesus would kill an animal?
We know he cooked fish and ate it, so we know he had to kill the fish.
We definitely don't know that.
Yeah,
sure we do.
Sure we do.
We don't believe John is a historical account.
John's not the one that says that only.
No, Luke says it as well, but the ending of Luke is, many scholars believe the ending of Luke was tacked on. We can't know for sure.
No,
but
John 21.
Based on what manuscript evidence do they argue that? Because
I'll pull it up.
Both Stephen and I are very well versed in the manuscript evidence, and we're dealing with something that I don't think can be backed up.
We'll get into that. Pull it up, Aaron.
Well, Luke is also making a very concerted effort to refute Marcionism. And Marcion's whole thing was Jesus was never a physical person.
Later.
No, Marcion's not even born. Marcion's not even born.
This is part of the theory, is that some of these passages have been added into Luke to refute Marcion, who used the Gospel of Luke. They're trying to take Luke away from Marcion, so they add these passages later, 150 AD or whatever.
But we have citations of this. We have citations of this passage that are earlier than Marcion.
I want to get into
who made them up.
I want to get into the, we can get into the fish stuff. That'd be great. I love that conversation. It's one of my favorite ones. But the previous question, you mentioned Jesus, like, how would he literally kill a lamb, like a baby lamb? How would he do it?
He wasn't a priest. He didn't kill lambs.
He was a rabbi.
Rabbis
do not sacrifice. He is a Judite. He's not a Levite.
So
he
then
is
you
not
believe
responsible.
So then you believe Jesus wouldn't have killed an animal,
but not basis.
You said
not
an animal or a lamb. You're asking about sacrifice.
A lamb
for sacrifice, or just to kill somebody.
Sacrifice, kosher, whichever.
He would not have sacrificed a lamb because he was not a Levitical priest.
What about on Passover?
He would have. He celebrated Passover every year of his life. That's why he was in Jerusalem at 12 years old and his parents lost him. I mean, they would have been celebrating in all of the festivities that happened at Passover, including the Passover lamb.
But it's interesting, right, that in
But
the
he wouldn't have
Synoptics,
killed
he
them.
doesn't eat lamb for Passover. He eats bread and wine.
No, he institutes. He institutes bread and wine at the end.
he institutes.
Read it carefully. At the end of the Passover feast.
But there's no narrative that Jesus ate a lamb on Passover. You're assuming he did, and maybe he did, but we don't think he did. It's not.
And again, going back to Jared.
So Luke 22, Jesus says, "Go prepare the Passover supper so that we may eat it." We know what preparation of the Passover supper would have included, and there is no way it would not have included the killing of the lamb, because that is the whole point of the Passover supper.
Exactly. That is the dish.
Nobody would have thought anything otherwise, because that's the central point of the Passover. There is no Passover if there is no lamb slaughtered. It doesn't necessarily mean Jesus would have slaughtered it, but Jesus, especially within a sacrificial system, but Jesus tells his disciples to go slaughter the lamb, in the sense that the preparation would have entailed that the lamb be slaughtered. Otherwise, it would not have been considered the Passover. It would just have been considered a meal.
Really quickly though, remove the word implied. You do agree, just so everyone is aware, because there's a lot of people might listen to this that haven't read these passages in the Bible. You would agree that it does not say that Jesus ate a Passover lamb. You can maybe infer it from your understanding of the Passover based on the evidence of Hebrew tradition, etc. But it doesn't say in the text itself that Jesus ate a Passover lamb.
It would have been the equivalent of saying, go to a Christmas tree farm for Christmas in order to decorate your house. If I said to Stephen, go to a Christmas tree farm, and you would say, well, you can't actually claim that Stephen is going to go cut down a Christmas tree. Like that's implied. Yes, there would be no other reason to go to a Christmas tree farm during Christmas if my specific reason for telling him to do so is to get ready for decorating his household.
Okay.
The Passover feast would have assumed and entailed the killing of a lamb. Otherwise, it would not have been the Passover.
But we agree that Jesus was changing the very nature and all of that was for it, in addition to eating it, because the lamb was going to be eaten from then on, and it was him. That is this is my body. This is my blood. Jesus says in John 6, whoever doesn't eat my flesh and drink my blood can have no abiding in me, nor me in him. But whoever eats my flesh, drinks my blood. Remember, John does not tell us that, what the synoptics have of this, because again, John is a spiritual gospel who's interpreting what Jesus meant by these things. See, he was the Lamb of God, John 1, that takes away the sin of the world. And he was the lamb that was going to be feasted on for Passover from that point on. And it was going to be both body and blood that he gives that into. So Jesus is the new lamb that'll be feasted on. The church, the early church, believed that when they were taking communion, they were actually eating the body and blood of Christ. In fact, they were accused of cannibalism. Ignatius of Antioch, who was trained by John himself, who was also a successor of Peter in Antioch, stated that whoever denies that the wine is not the blood and that the body is not in the bread is actually a heretic, and that the heretics were denying the bodily presence in these elements. The church believed that Jesus was teaching, and so did his disciples and their disciples, that they were actually eating body and blood of Christ, the true Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. So yes, a lamb was removed, but the feasting on a body actually was not removed. It was instituted through the bread and the wine, which Jesus said is my body and blood.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, one of the patristic quotes we have has Jesus saying, I do not desire to eat lamb with you on this Passover. And that's specifically why he uses bread and wine, because they were against the idea of eating meat altogether. And so the earlier Jewish Christian text is trying to show this is what the Jewish Christians, the followers of Jesus, believed in practice. They were against sacrifices, abstained from meat. And many of the church fathers all attest to this as well.
And Epiphanius in his writings on the Nazarenes, again, Jesus the Nazarene, says that the Nazarenes were like the Hebrews, were like the Jews, the Hebrews in every way, except they attested animal sacrifice and did not even eat the flesh because they thought it was unlawful to do so. because they believe that Moses had received a law, but not this law, some other. And we believe that actually ties. If we ask the question, does that tie back to Jeremiah 8, verse 8, which states that the lying pen of the scribes has falsified the Torah, which is just one chapter later after Jeremiah says, you've made this house a den of murderers, parits. And he also states in Jeremiah 7:22 that God never commanded animal sacrifices on the day that he brought them out of Egypt. What is that day? That's the Passover. That's the blood over the doorpost when they're exiting on the Exodus. So
he didn't command it because he'd already done it. He'd already made the sacrifice.
Who's he?
God makes the sacrifice.
What do you mean?
Sacrifice?
Right, but so I want to go back to the similar but different, because you just conflated the Nazarenes with Jesus being a Nazarene. The Nazarites that are condemned.
Not Nazarites, Nazarenes.
Right. So Jesus is not one of them, because Jesus is from the physical location of Nazareth.
Yes. And
right. In the same way,
the quote that Aaron gave, again, these quotes that you're
Jesus
giving,
is from the physical location of Nazareth, and we have the archaeological evidence of his hometown.
Well, yeah, we have okay, so that's a whole other. We have archaeological evidence of a hamlet or a village based on pottery and these types of things, but we don't have evidence of a town named Nazareth until 200 years after Jesus' death in any historical record. Now, that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean
discount. Only if you discount the first century documents that are in the Gospels. So you have to extrapolate the data based on later evidence and then read it back.
Well, the overwhelming
rather than
the Gospels.
Similar to the destruction of the temple, many scholars believe that that's the reason why they date them after 70 AD is because they included that in the Gospels after it had already happened.
Correct. So if you assume naturalistic assumptions and you date the Gospels based on the fact that Jesus could not have predicted the destruction of the temple, then sure. But we don't do that unless you're a physicalist and you don't think that Jesus could have predicted the destruction of the temple.
For sure.
But all I'm saying is that there's a later group that's condemned called the Nazarenes.
No. Epiphanius says they existed even before Christ.
Yeah.
But he's telling you that what they're teaching and what you quoted is a corrupted form of them. I think we keep missing this point.
But we don't. But that's the thing is we don't believe that. Of course, of course, the early church fathers who are condemning the earliest Jewish Christians.
They condemned all Jewish Christian groups.
No. They're not condemning the early forms of these as much as they are the current forms that
because they were living during the early forms. They were condemning the form of their day, which of course descends back to the first century. The very group Jesus emerged from is the same group centuries later that the Roman Catholic Church condemns as heretics.
No. There's the Roman using the term Roman Catholic is anachronistic at this point in time. But yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
No. Going back to Aaron, your quote about Jesus refusing your statement about Jesus and the lamb and refusing it, that was one of the later interpolations that was not a part of the practice. Again, these are condemnation quotes. They're not promotional quotes. They're condemnation quotes. They're not looking at this as a positive.
But here, look for a second. Would you guys afford me 5 minutes to lay out something that can explain what you're talking about right now? But the only way that I can explain it is if I have that amount of time on the Ebionite Nazarene later, rebuke from Epiphanius. And that is, you asked earlier, Wes, what is our full methodology? And Aaron, you can correct me at any point if you want to on this or add to it or whatever.
Sure.
Be sure to do that. So when we let's just start with the canonized Bible. When we start in the beginning, we start in the Garden of Eden. No suffering, no death, definitely no animal slaughter. It says even predatory animals don't, prey on.
I would assume that there's animal death. I would.
Where do you assume that, and where does that come from in say the vision up to Genesis 1:30?
It's a little bit later in Genesis.
Yeah, no, there has to be. And even the tilling of the garden assumes that there is, animal rot, or not animal, sorry, plant rot, in order for there to be life. That's
no. I'm not talking about plant life. I'm talking about animal life. I'm saying specifically in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 1:29, it says that plants will be for human food. And it even goes on to say in Genesis 1:30 that even animals will eat the herbs of the ground, plant food as well. So it attests to this kind of even non-predatory state of animals, which is then reflected in the prophetic kingdom of heaven that Jesus is always talking about. In Isaiah 11, the wolf shall lay with the lamb, the lion shall eat straw like the ox.
Child shall play with the serpent.
The child will lay with a serpent. They shall not hurt nor destroy. And again, remember I said that root in the Hebrew of destroy is actually shakat, which is to slaughter an animal. So on our in the kingdom heaven vision that Jesus himself prays in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And let me point out, he says, give us this day our daily bread, by the way, which I think is a nice little touch with our previous conversation about the Passover versus the Last Supper. But anyhow,
but it's still a body. It's still a body.
His vision, sure. His vision, though, the vision that's being cast is a non-predatory ideal where we as humans, at minimum, because we have agency, are not to slaughter and kill other animals. So you don't agree with that with the Garden of Eden or the idyllic kingdom of heaven vision, say in Isaiah 11.
Not in the new heaven and the new earth, but in Genesis chapter 1, they're told to subdue and have dominion. And Chabash definitely has a violent act to it. In fact, that's the word for conquer that's used later.
Subdue? You mean subdue? The word used for subdue?
Yeah. Force.
I can find a handful of concordances that would also point to that being a word like tame. To tame, the same way we tame our pets, which funny enough, we talk about is the kingdom of heaven here or not. It says the wolf shall lay with the lamb. I bet each one of you have a dog at home. Maybe you don't, but you do. That's a wolf that's been tamed that will lay with a lamb and not eat it. So I see that word, and I think rabbinical tradition would potentially agree that that word is like a taming of creation. And then that word dominion, we can get into that as well. But the bigger point is you're talking about Genesis 1:26 through 27 or 8. Then if you continue to read in Genesis 1:29, after that statement is made, it says humans shall only eat the herbs of the field, or the fruit-bearing trees and the herbs which bear the seed. So dominion has to be in the framework of no death for any human need or purpose, namely food. No murder.
St. John Chrysostom also said that killing innocent animals is demonic, and many of the early church fathers were vegetarian for that very reason,
including James the Just, Jesus's brother, which is another point. Again, I'd like to paint this picture if I could. I know we're getting hung up on whether or not you agree or disagree with.
I would actually say that there was animal death before. I would say that the sin and death is clearly referring to the death of humans, and there's a long tradition going back into. Thomas Aquinas advocates for the fact that there's death before.
I'm not saying death. I'm saying murder. I'm saying murder. There's no human hand in God's ideal slaying or taking the life of one of God's creatures, which that human did not create. Only God created.
Except when God kills an animal to make skins for Adam and Eve.
It doesn't say. It says
he kills them. It says he makes skins. He clothes them in skin is all it says.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I believe that's the Hebrew word or, which means light, which can also mean skin of an animal or a human or a tree and other things.
We're
getting lost in the weeds. Wes, by the way,
let me chime in here. I think this is secondary. I mean, this is.
I don't think it's secondary at all, Anton.
I think it is, because it's implying things like Brahmanism and Hinduism and karma. That if you harm an animal.
No, we're not implying
we didn't say anything about karma.
What we're implying essentially is that the idea that God would require ritual death and bloodshed for forgiveness is a pagan idea that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years before Mosaic law was ever introduced. And every ancient culture practiced this practice of animal sacrifice. Dr. Kip Davis has a great course on this you can take, where he shows that in the ancient world, these cultures were sort of taking the pantheon of gods and trying to keep one of them almost like a pet, where you make a temple for the god to live in and you offer sacrifices to appease the god and feed it. And so the sacrificial practice is unworthy of God's people was always the idea of Jeremiah and the prophets who opposed it. They're saying this is not, God never commanded this from us.
And again, if I can bring it back to, because same as ours, I don't want to bash about being the fringe opinion, but I would say, Wes, I'm pretty sure you're in the fringe opinion that there would be murder of animals in the Garden of Eden. But moving on from that, the prophetic kingdom of heaven, it is clear in Isaiah 11 that not only will humans not slaughter animals, they shall not hurt nor slaughter on my holy mountain, but that animals will return to that state of non-predation, that the wolf shall lay with the lamb, the child with the serpent, the lion shall eat straw like the ox. This is the vision of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus himself is professing is here now in our midst. It's at hand. And he prayed for it to be willed on earth as it is in heaven. So the point that we're making is that's God's ideal. So that's the beginning. When you talk about context in the biblical scripture, this is the full context. This is the very beginning of the story, starting at the beginning and ending at the ending, or the prophetic endings, should I say. So then you have prophets who come after these Levitical priestly laws, like Aaron saying, people like Kip Davis attest to this, that there's an idea that these laws of man, of slaying animals and killing animals, is not God's ideal. And there's all kinds of conversations that we could have
Kip
about
would
how
never say that. Kip would never say that. Kip
would
say that Kip is saying that
he would say
they were absolutely requiring.
I'm not saying Kip would say that. I'm saying Kip would say that these practices are common for pagan, Amos 5:25.
I'd actually argue veganism is more pagan.
Sure, but I mean, even the temple systems.
How is that the case? We're not even talking about veganism, Anton.
So, hold on, because correlation, causation, once again. So if you look at temples within the ancient Near East, within what is modern day Iraq and Iran, and even in Egypt, they have a Holy of Holies. So Egyptians circumcised before the Israelites did. So just because pagans do something doesn't mean that God doesn't, that God isn't using something that is a frame of reference for the culture of the day, and that is then something that he doesn't desire. Because the Holy of Holies is something that we find, say, in the Temple of Luxor. And we find that the priest was only allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. And so we don't then say that the temple as an institution, therefore, is a pagan system entirely that is wrong, because God in general clearly says that the temple is a good thing. But I actually think you have to read something into the text in Genesis 3:21 when it says that Yahweh made a garment of skin. Why did he make that? Just invented animal skins? Because it's implied
in the Genesis account. Does he not just create everything in the beginning? There was no light, then there becomes light. He creates humans from dust. Sure, he could create animal skin without death.
Something is the exact
the whole narrative. The whole narrative that is pointed back to in Leviticus is that the sin requires the death, and the punctuation of that is that God then kills an animal and clothes them in the death because of their sin. You have to read that into the text. It doesn't say
God killed an animal, though. You're adding that into the text.
Let me ask you something. Let me ask something. And let's fast forward one chapter over there. Did God receive the vegetarian sacrifice of Cain, or did he receive Abel's bloody sacrifice of an animal?
It says nowhere in there anything about blood in Abel's sacrifice. It says the firstling of the flock. It says nothing about killing that sacrifice. It could have been just laying out some, again, too, I want to make it clear, this is outside of now God's ideal, right? Because humans have sinned as well.
But he accepted it, didn't he? Did he not accept it?
Well, again, looking at the text itself, it doesn't say anything about an animal being killed. It says that he brought the firstling and the fat thereof. It's the fattest firstborn, greatest.
How do you get the fat from the animal, Cam? How do you get the fat from the animal?
Well, I don't think anywhere that it implies that it's fat from the flesh. That you can use similar terms for milk fat, like colostrum and these types of things. There's nothing there that implies it. But I think, again, this is diverting from the point. The point is there's an ideal. The Bible has texts where the narrative shows when humans fall away from that ideal and do different things. I'm sure you could pull out so many. We can argue all day long about the differences of these opinions. What we're showing is that those pulling towards the ideal are the prophets that are saying God never Jeremiah 7:22, God never commanded sacrifices. Isaiah, you're full of this. I don't want your sacrifices. They're an abomination. These types of things. Amos 5:25 says, did you ever offer me sacrifices in the wilderness? With an implied answer, no. And he then goes on to say how, comparing the animal sacrificial ritual of male and bullock, which is basically, I think we can all agree, a type of a satanic practice. So what we're showing, this is the point that I was making, is you see these prophets continually throughout the text of the Old Testament calling people back to mercy. God desires mercy, not
obedience
sacrifice.
is better than sacrifice.
Obedience rather than burnt offerings, not obedience with sacrifices,
Not
obedience
murder with a pure
rather
heart.
than sacrifices. And then basically what we're saying, this was giving a context to the Ebionite thing, is that at a certain point you have Jesus, like I said at the beginning of this talk, fulfilling this idea by literally going into the temple. No other being that I know on planet Earth has ever done this. And we're not talking about just any temple. We're not talking about a Hindu temple or a Buddhist temple. We're talking about the most ward over piece of property on planet Earth, basically the Temple Mount, one like the center of the universe, let's call it, in terms of religion. He goes into that place, frees the animals, and overturns it and says, you've made this house, which should be a house of prayer, into a den. What is a den? It's a place you keep animals, a den of murderers. And so therefore, when we see things like Jesus being called the Nazarene all throughout the New Testament by that designation, and particularly Nazarios underneath it, actually creates some complications of whether or not that title could mean someone from Nazareth. There could have been a town named Nazareth. Absolutely, there could have been. But it's a chicken or the egg thing. Was it called Nazareth because was Jesus called the Nazarene because he was from Nazareth, or was the sect of was Nazareth called Nazareth because the sect of Nazarenes were there? That's an interesting question. And the point that we're bringing up is that then you get into these patristic writings of the early church fathers, and you see that there's this sect of Nazarenes that abhors animal sacrifice, believes that Moses received a law, but some other, not this law around animal sacrifices and flesh consumption. And they're correlated with the Ebion and the Ebionites in these early church fathers' writings. However, the church fathers are waving them away as heresy and saying, look at what their text says. It says that Jesus attests sacrifice and that he didn't accept the Passover lamb. And what we're saying is that's our methodology, is we see this whole story from the beginning of the scripture to the end of the scripture in the prophetic kingdom of heaven, which God said is here and now in our midst, and it's at hand. He declared the year of the Lord's favor to free the oppressed. And I believe that, doesn't it make sense? Is Jesus not the liberator of the oppressed? Do you think that the lambs that were going into Passover were liberated? Were they free, or were they being subjugated to murder and torture over and over again? How would Jesus feel about that? Just the same way we've seen that the Bible has been used to justify slavery with certain texts. Is it not? Does it not make sense for Jesus? You said, Wes, he's the lamb. He lays his life down for the lamb. The good shepherd lays his life down for the lamb. I know that could be obviously talking about the lost flock of Israel and people, but could it not be similarly applied to actual animals, God's creatures that we didn't create, therefore we don't have the justification to take the life of? And so he's standing on that. So then I would ask you, if so, then how would Jesus kill an animal? What do you see Jesus killing an animal? Do you see him shedding blood?
Yes.
How?
He killed fish. He cooked fish.
Well, first of all, we can get into those texts, but
He
we don't
killed
know.
and he
It says
cooked and he
nothing
ate
about
fish.
him catching any fish. And in the Gospel of John 21, chapter 21, there's two words that are used there, prosphagion and upsarion, which are used to be the fish that he's eating. And it's a relish or anything eaten with bread. And in fact, opson in the ancient Greek, the only, in Wes, I know this is your speciality, I would encourage you, find any version of opsarion or opson in the classics or whatever where it references fish. It actually is in Homer's Iliad. It's a relish made from onion. So, but again, John 21, John 20 seems to end anyways, and I know you know that there's a
so hold on. So they caught relish when they couldn't catch
they
relish
caught
the whole
ichthus.
night.
They caught
What were they
ichthus.
catching?
Ichthus. Yeah.
Fish.
Which is a fish. That is
Right.
that's
Wes. And it's also, Wes, I loved it, by the way. It was an awesome piece of content. You outlined just recently the ichthus as the acronym Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior, related to
that's later. That's
later.
Sure.
after that. We don't have any
ichthus was used way
attestation.
before Jesus.
We
Ichthus
don't have,
means fish. In
there's
classic,
no other word you would use to describe fish other than ichthus, and they are fishermen. They would fish for fish.
They did,
There's
but then Jesus said, "Come follow me," and it says they dropped their nets.
no, that's earlier. Hold up.
And there also may be a distinction between Jesus being okay with eating fish, but not living animals on the land, lambs and goats. And
or there's he's in a resurrected body at this point. Again, he could have created the fish out of thin air if you believe that he's a resurrected body like that.
And that's why he had to broil it.
They just caught it. They caught it, and he took it.
That's from John that says they caught it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. In John 21, he said,
a historical account.
He says,
What's
"Cast your net."
We don't take John to be a historical.
Okay, so then take it earlier when they couldn't catch in the synoptics that you do take as a historical account. They couldn't catch it, and Jesus helped manipulate a circumstance where they would catch more of it, so much it almost flipped their boats over because they had so many.
Yeah, and
That wasn't relish.
it says it broke their net. It says it broke their nets, meaning the fish got out of the net, and that's when they dropped.
No. That's not what it means.
That's not what it says. It says that their boats almost tipped over.
Right. Their boats almost tipped over, and the nets began breaking. And not long after that is when Jesus said, "Come follow me and become fishers of men." And they left their nets behind.
Because he was telling them to leave their family businesses to come follow him because he had a better plan for them, and it wasn't catching fish anymore, it was men. But he still helped them catch fish. He's helping them catch it.
Miracle fish, yeah. So again,
so it's not real
fake.
Fish.
So they're fantasy.
They're magic fish. They're not.
No, I'm not
fish.
saying they're magic fish. I'm saying the act is a miracle in and of itself. And going back to John 21,
but hold on, no. But if they're real fish, did he help them catch by a miracle? We think it's a miracle too. Did he help them catch real fish, or are they just hallucinations?
If we take it at face value, I'll take it at face value. Then I want to talk about John 21 and the potentiality of this being some type of Hellenistic or Pythagorean, potentially even influenced story or text. But let's take it at face value first. I love taking it at face value.
But what you're saying is that you're not actually going to read scripture for what it actually says. You're going to read in a context that implies
in the context of the entire Bible, of the ideal kingdom of heaven in the Garden of the ideal in the Garden of Eden, and the kingdom of heaven in the prophetic vision that Jesus lays out for us,
but we're talking about fish specifically here. We're talking about fish specifically here, and you're going to talk about. You were going to mention the John 21 Pythagorean.
Well, we can talk about that. It's fun. It's super fun. It's a super fun conversation. So,
where did that come from? Was it Pythagorean himself, or was it a biography of him written later?
It was a biography of him written later. I'm aware of that. But the point.
What year? After or before John?
I don't know, but it doesn't. It could have been after. That's not my point.
Third century.
Yeah,
that's great.
Over 250 years after Jesus. So we can't read.
But wait a minute. That's not my point. I'll agree with you. Sure, it was written later, the Pythagorean account, but that's not my point.
You're saying that John's trying to do something and also stealing from the past, even though it was actually in the future.
I'm not even saying I'm not going to put my intentions or try to understand what John was doing. I'm just going to read the text and tell you what I see, which is that it specifically says in John 21, which, mind you, I know you guys know this. I'm not saying you have to agree or disagree with this, but there are scholars who say that John 21 is tacked on because it looks like John 20 ends, right? It looks like it's tacked on, but still, I love that text. I love John 21.
Or it's just a prologue and epilogue like most works, but go ahead. There's no manuscript evidence
words in the prologue and the epilogue.
It's not based on the manuscript evidence, though. It's based on speculation of the flow of the text. So every manuscript that we have within the early church tradition, I do have to point out that the broiled fish, the optos of the ichthus, was in Luke
24.
Luke, but we're jumping to Luke. Let's stay in John. We can get to that. Let's take.
Well, I think the only reason I'm mentioning it is because Aaron said he doesn't hold Luke as historical, but there is no other way to read autou ichthus optu meros.
When I was I want to clarify what
him
I
a
was saying
piece
was
of
in John.
broiled fish.
Okay, so
But I
go back
wasn't
to
talking
John.
about Luke.
No,
I
he's
was talking.
clarifying what Aaron said. He's not clarifying what you. He's not. He wasn't
Okay.
clarifying Cam. He was clarifying what Aaron said. So
I think, though, guys, this is deviating pretty far from
Yeah.
our actual thesis here, which again is that the
no,
Ten
he asked
Commandments
if
say.
he's asked
hold on.
if Jesus would kill
The
an
Ten
animal.
Commandments say.
No, I
that
didn't say if he
thou
would. I said
shalt not-
how. I said how would he, particularly a land animal, say like a lamb, which he laid his life down for the lost sheep. How would Jesus?
That's an emotional argument. I think
I'm not.
it.
No, I'm
it,
asking
it
how.
only
No,
goes
it's
so
not
far.
emotional because I want to, as a Christ
So-
follower, what would Jesus do?
Right,
like I said,
right. It's analogous. It's analogous with all due respect to when my Muslim friends talk about the virgin birth and say, would God really go through the vaginal canal and be covered in blood and be covered in, the placenta? Would God let himself be put through that? Because that is disgusting and that is bloody and that is beneath him. So this is an emotional play in saying, how would Jesus hold a knife, and how would he hold it to the throat of the animal?
I don't think God coming through the vaginal canal is the same as taking the life of another living being.
Neither do I, but I'm saying the type of methodology by which the argument is applied is an emotional one.
No, we'll give you the methodology. It's very simple. The Ten Commandments say, "Thou shalt not kill," and Jesus was very clear. If you want to enter
it says,
eternal
"Thou
life,
shalt not
keep
murder."
the commandments. Sure,
Yeah,
right.
Thou shalt not murder.
Yeah, which is
Murder
even
or kill,
more. It's intentional killing.
Really quickly,
it doesn't qualify
just
humans
on
or
a
animals.
similar-
It says, "Thou shalt not kill," and so we're saying Jesus was against the act of killing in any form. That's the argument.
Unless it's a fish.
What are your guys' take on abortion?
I'm against it. I was almost aborted, so I'm very much against it.
Yeah, I want to respect the free will of everyone, so I would never want to mandate you're not allowed to do it.
How
But
can you
me personally,
possibly?
I'm totally against it.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. But I thought you were about to say something else. So
Okay, so
yeah,
John 21, he cooked the fish and gave it to his disciples to eat. Well, that's where we left off. He cooked the fish and gave it to them to eat, and he ate it with them. All right.
And the Greek underneath that word is opson, which, like I said, is used in the Greek classics, Homer's Iliad, to be an onion relish. It's opsarion, actually, is the Greek word, but opson is the, I guess opsarion's like a diminutive.
What's the word for fish used in Homer?
I don't know, but my point
It's
is
the same word. It's the same word.
Can I have just 1 second to explain my point about Pythagoras? It has nothing to do with Pythagoras' story being written later or not. It's that in the text of John 21, the number 153 is given with the ichthus. Now, the ichthus is, as you showed, Wes, on your recent content, also related to the Jesus symbol of the Vesica Pisces, the two concentric circles overlapping each other. And in Pythagorean thought, they held the number 153 as sacred because the point to point of the ichthus is 265 over from the width of the overlap, 153. Now, the probability, I actually chat GPT'd this the other day. It was kind of fun. The probability of 153 and ichthus appearing in John 21 and it not being related to this concept of the Vesica Pisces and this kind of Pythagorean thought. I'm not even saying it is literally Pythagorean or Pythagoras, but it's that type of thought. The probability of it not being related to it is like trillions to one. When you account for that, about 3,000 fish could have been caught in a net. So it could have been any number between 1 and 3,000. And then you apply that to the probability of ichthus also, being Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior, and the secondary name of the bladder of the fish, which is the Vesica Pisces. So what I'm getting at is this account in John clearly has these other underlying meanings that are happening in there. And like we said, there are many people who say that the Gospel of John ends in 22. So all I'm saying, look here. All I'll say is
I don't think any of that is there. I don't think any of that is there. I think you have to take later texts and later interpretations based on things.
But what about the 153 number? What about the 153 number? Do you think
numerology really doesn't go very far with me because you can extrapolate numbers. I mean, my friends within the Billy Carson community do this ad nauseum with every archaeological discovery that exists and find all sorts of connections to the speed of light and to the equinox. And you can basically, I have a mathematician friend who has basically done it with everything. And it's what my Muslim friends do with the Quran, the numerological arguments for the Quran. And it really doesn't go very far with me. I did just look up optos as broiled, and I found numerous instances of it in Greco-Roman literature but that's not what's in Luke 24.
No,
Optos.
I'm not talking about Luke. I'm talking about John 21, opsin. Luke's a separate instance that we could discuss. And I agree with Aaron. We are getting
sounds like it's coming from a similar root word too, by the way.
Yeah. We're getting into the week, though. They didn't sacrifice fish. So I would like to get back on the topic of animal sacrifices and how God, Jesus.
But it's on a charcoal fire, John says. So it has to be burnt. It has to be like
John's not a historical account.
Yes, it is. But
that's not true. It's an interpretation of a historical account, meaning it's
so
telling the history.
Problems to call John that you have to jump over to call John a historical account. It is wildly divergent from the synoptics. I don't know of any scholars, at least non-Christian scholars, who would say John is a historical account. Zero.
And the point being is too, if I could just say this, because I don't want to get lost in the sauce of these. Really, what I find fascinating conversations around the number 153 and the relevance to fish, the fact that in John there's 3 different words that are in Greek that are translated as fish. There's so many things we could talk about that's really fun. But what I'm more interested in is that Jesus is always calling people towards the higher ideal. Yes, they may have been fishermen, but then they left their nets behind and became fishers of men. Yes, it says in the feeding of the multitudes that 2 fish were brought. However, Jesus, in his own recalling of the telling, says, don't you remember when I multiplied the loaves, and doesn't mention the fish? He also tells them when Peter is walking on the water or whatever, that they didn't understand the miracle of the loaves, or they didn't understand what was meant by the loaves. These types of conversations are having where it seems clear that Jesus isn't interested in the fish. He's interested in their hearts. And that's our point with animal sacrifice, is that the prophets and Jesus are calling people towards that liberated vision of freedom for the oppressed, including God's creatures in the prophetic vision of the kingdom of heaven. And that's why when Aaron and I fall on, say, the Nazarenes and the Ebionim, or the Ebionites, which again the church fathers are trying to hand wave away, they match this overall greater context of the text of the canon, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls, like we showed you with the congregation of the Ebionim and the patristic fathers, who were trying to condemn them. But thank you, church fathers, that you did, because they preserved some of our writings so that we can see what they were actually about. And that first century movement, James the Just, Jesus's brother, is very, very clear in multiple historical documents that he did not have animal flesh, even from his mother's womb. It says he never had animal flesh. That matches the Nazarene. So he was raised by Mary, if he's Jesus's brother, and then there's this whole context of the Nazarenes and the Ebionites saying this same type of thing. John the Baptist is taking people out to remove them from the animal sacrificial
ritual. The same mother that took doves to the temple to be sacrificed, right?
But that's what I'm saying. You asked me earlier, how do we find the contradiction?
That's in Luke. I thought Luke was historical.
I don't take the synoptics to be historical accounts.
You don't take
it's not black or white, like it is or it isn't history. It's very complex. It's when you tell stories, you can get main details right, but disagree on Bart Ehrman has a great exercise where he walks into his class and he takes his jacket off, puts his computer down, coughs, puts his jacket back on, and then he says, hey, why don't you guys write down what you just saw? And then they compare notes, and everybody has the details completely different. So I think they're historical in the sense that they're referring to real things that happened. There was a Jesus, he did get crucified, all these things. But the little specifics like this, we can't say are definitely historical from the synoptics.
So when Jesus says,
my opinion, I know you guys would disagree.
Yeah, does anybody know which gospel is actually written in chronological order?
Say again?
Do you know which gospel is written in chronological order?
Order according to what?
To Jesus's ministry and his life, his miracles, his decisions.
But according to what, though?
Which one claims to be?
Time.
Which one claimed to be chronological?
And timeline.
I'm not sure.
John, the one that you said is not historical.
It's definitely not historical.
Well, it claims to be putting an organized and orderly account together of Jesus' ministry from a certain point to a certain point. That would imply historical layout.
Yeah, and again, I think there's history in John, like the big events, cleansing of the temple. I'm not saying there's nothing is true in John. That's not my position. I just think we
But
can't rely on it like a history textbook or something. And I don't
Well,
know
what
any
it,
scholars that would
I
say that you can.
because there's a misunderstanding of what Clement of Alexandria and others are saying, that it actually is an account of what Jesus did, but the actual author is giving you the full meaning of it. It's not saying it's not historical, it's only spiritual. It's historical with the spiritual implication behind it, because he's trying to tell you why, not just what, but why.
But they can't. But the point is, they can't all be historical when John strongly disagrees with the chronology of the synoptics, and even the synoptics
Where?
disagree with each other.
Where does John disagree with the
Let's go into it.
synoptics?
Well, I think what's going on here is that you believe them or you don't believe them. I feel like
that's not how it works.
the
how it works.
methodology.
That's ideology, Wes.
No,
That's not how it
No. So your methodology by choosing the text that you choose to believe.
I don't choose
is
to believe
based
any
on-
texts. I read the Gospels through a historical, critical method of taking the context of each book, why it was written, what are the rhetorical goals of the author, what's the historical context, and you have to do your best to parse out what is probably history from what isn't.
But
You can't
with
say
all due
anything
respect, I
definitely
mean,
is
Stephen and
history.
I have taught this at the graduate level. We understand what a grammatical historical method is. I mean, I've taught this at the graduate level at the biggest secular university in Canada. So it's not that you're doing this and we're not.
I'm not saying that.
It's the fact that the methodology by which we're pointing out texts and saying there's both a grammatical and a face value reading of something like fish, that we're saying, okay, this is how it's read. And I've even found, instances of opsarion that just mean a small piece of fish now in the Hellenistic literature, and can't mean anything but that. But all I'm saying is that
I'd love
I think
to see that. The only one I could find was Homer's Iliad, and it was an onion relish, upson. But what I was going to say too is just in.
No, that's fine. I just think it's like, I feel like when we see instances of Jesus telling people to sacrifice, he's not doing that, or he's capitulating his own moral values. When we see instances of Mary and Joseph going to the temple to sacrifice, well, that's either non-historical, or it's added in later, or it's not really what's going on. So when we have instances, I mean, going back to Bart Ehrman, Bart Ehrman claims that the synoptics don't claim Jesus is God, other than when they claim Jesus is God. And when they do claim Jesus is God, they can't be claiming Jesus is God, because Jesus never claims to be God.
So going with the Bible itself, Wes, part of why we would question something like Luke in this account of him telling the leper to go perform a sacrifice is given that methodology that I told you about, the grander context of God's ideal, and also weighing it against texts like Jeremiah 8:8, which Jesus seemed to be a big Jeremiah fan, that the lying pen of the scribes, the pen that writes the Torah, has falsified the Torah, and he condemns them for this. So it's claiming in the Bible itself that there are alterations that have weight. And he's the same prophet that's condemning animal sacrifice. He says God never commanded animal sacrifice. And why I want to bring up that point is because,
that's not what he says.
Except where he does, you have to say that was added later too, and then you're just doing the same thing in the Old Testament that you're doing in the Gospels here. So you have to remove these things from the Old Testament to get that narrative, and then you have to remove those things in the New Testament and say, see, there's a narrative, when actually you're just doing exactly what Epiphanius condemns. You're doing exactly what Jerome was condemning. You're doing exactly what Eusebius is condemning, and that is, you have a belief system that has allowed you to add, remove, and edit text to make them what you want. And you're actually trying to use these men to defend your position when they're actually condemning your position, because you're doing the same thing that they were doing in their lifetimes. That's the summary.
I'm not using them to defend the position. I'm very aware that they see it as heresy. The point is, in fact, that they do see it as heresy as part of what we'd like to even talk about beyond that with letters of Paul and these kind of things that do start to contradict some of the earliest followers of Jesus. Jesus' own brother was the leader of the Jerusalem church, and he never touched animal flesh for consumption. You understand? So that,
but that has nothing to do with Jesus. That has nothing to do with Mary and Joseph and all
but
these
again,
other things.
John the Baptist is taking people out to the desert, baptizing people for the remission of sins. That's what we're saying, is that we see these
while he's wearing animal skins that have been killed.
Okay,
and he's eating a locust,
or they died. You don't know they were killed.
Or
a tanner would. I mean, Stephen has looked extensively into this, but a tanner would not used an animal that was killed in order to make.
Yeah, John the Baptist wore a animal hide for a sash. Yeah. That was done through the tanning process. You can look at any process of making leathering and belts and things like that, and how they used an animal for this part, this part, and this part to create the leather-like being. John the Baptist was described as wearing a leather sash, which came from an animal that was produced by tanners. I mean, that's just the standard in Palestine.
Sure. So John the Baptist is eating locusts and honey, but to this day, the carob bean is still known as St. John's bread. And guess what? It's where locust bean comes from. Why? Because it's called the honey locust in its alternate form, and it's been called that for a long time. You can Wikipedia it right now, that there's tons of scholarship around the fact that John wasn't probably eating locusts and honey, but he was eating the carob pod, which grows all around that area near the Jordan and the Dead Sea and whatnot.
Okay. So let's just say that's true, while wearing a dead animal's hide for a sash.
Right. You're aware of the writings about Bannus, right?
Well, hold on. Why do we keep skipping this? Even if what you're saying is true, Cam, even if that's what he was eating was not actual locust, he's wearing a sash made from a tanner's production of killing an animal and taking its hide and making a leather substance from it.
I understand.
Even if he's just eating honey.
Again, so I take my methodology, which is God's ideal is no unnecessary suffering and death of animals for any reason, or humans, thou shalt not kill. So then I look at that and I say, are there any alternate understandings about this? Well, turns out Josephus records Bannus, who is seen to be, by, again, overwhelming scholarship, seems to show that he might have been a disciple of John the Baptist who wears only linen, which matches the same thing that James the Just wears, who also didn't have animal flesh. So again, it's you the same way that you guys, I'm sure, take your worldview about what you believe, and then you bring in little pieces to support that. It's really fun. I know how it is. I mean, I'm sure apologetics in this form that you guys do is fun, because when you find a good hook, you're like, oh, look at that proves this, that shows this. It seems to be that these groups wore linen, not animal skin. So I would say that that's probably a later interpretation of who John the Baptist is in that way.
No. Actually, Epiphanius, in one of his interpolations that he accuses them of adding in, uses actually that same word that the Gospels do. He does say that they changed locust to manna. He does say that, but he does not say that the early Matthew that you guys ascribe to, that you're saying is the better one, he does use the same word for the sash, the leather sash, in the original Hebrew Matthew, but does say they changed the locust to manna. So actually, your original Hebrew that you're saying is representative of this group is saying that John the Baptist walked around with a dead animal's hide on his belt. That's what it's saying.
Epiphanius also said that the Ebionites came from a man named Ebion, a man. So I think that there's a lot that Epiphanius says that may or may not hold up to the scrutiny of the methodology which we're presenting, which is that God's ideal.
No, at the beginning of this, you guys accepted all of these extra interpolations as saying that they are preserved by the fathers by quoting 40 plus sayings. This is one of the sayings. So now all of a sudden you're against this saying. You're saying it's not a good one because he might be wrong about a guy. So this one doesn't count.
He could be or he couldn't be. And maybe John the Baptist was wearing animal skins. It's the same kind of argument.
John the Baptist wearing leather doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything.
That's not the point.
Animals. It doesn't mean he even got it from a killed animal. If they were
Yeah.
strict vegetarians, they would find ways of getting leather without killing animals, just like vegetarians do today.
So you think
can't know any
that
of these things for sure?
you think they had access to those kinds of things back then, like we do today, Aaron?
Access to what?
To be able to create a leather sash that was known at that time to come from animal's hide, that they could just reproduce that with anything?
I'm saying that the animal that it came from didn't have to be killed, like murdered.
Yeah. So,
but that goes against tanning practices of the day,
Correct.
especially. So
This
you
proof
have
went
to.
against many practices of the day. Like we can't know for sure any of this stuff. So it's kind of, in my opinion, it's just kind of a waste.
No.
Of our
It's an
time
argument
here.
from silence. So it's an inference to the best explanation based on what we do know, not based on what we don't know. So we do know tanning practices within first century Palestine.
Correct.
And we do know how that would have operated. And based on every piece of evidence that we do have, John the Baptist would have been wearing a skin that was killed and produced in a very particular way, because you would not have an animal that was dead on the side of the road and make it into leather. You wouldn't.
Or
Not
an animal
in
that you
first
raised
century.
in your own community.
Well, let me ask you
And I
this.
agree with
guys
you.
know
I
this,
agree
like,
with you. It could have been animal skin that was from a killed animal, but my point is that doesn't mean John ate animals or killed animals.
nobody's promoting. He's promoting it around by wearing it. I mean, most people that are against killing animals will remove anything that has animal byproduct in it, everything from their shampoo to everything. So why would John sit there and promote, even if it was a dead animal on the side of the road that he made a belt from? Why would he promote that by wearing it?
True, which is what I do. I don't wear leather, but there are people that have animal ethical stances that will use leather products that are secondhand or whatever, because of, it's not them literally doing the killing. It's going to go into the ground, whatever. I don't agree with that, but I'm saying there are people that do that. The point is what Aaron's saying is that John the Baptist is the forerunner of this movement. He's calling people away from the animal sacrificial ritual to baptism. And James the Just, Jesus's brother, is not consuming any flesh and is a part of it. There's many scholars that point to the idea that, or at least there's significant scholarship that points to the idea that the Ebionite movement is connected to James the Just, Jesus's brother, actually. And so what I'm saying is that it doesn't make any sense for John the Baptist to be here and James the Just to be here, and then Jesus to be this crazy outlier that's not following that same thread. And in fact, I think it's the opposite. One of the most agreed upon historical accounts of Jesus, other than his crucifixion, is his temple cleanse, right? Would you agree? I mean, the large majority of historians do agree that some incident like this happened. I think that this is the key and most important distinction about Jesus and his ministry that, adds to the beauty of the miracles and everything, is that he went in and he stood up finally where John the Baptist was taking people out into the wilderness and baptizing them to get them away from the temple. He said, let's go in and let's finally do what Isaiah and Jeremiah and everyone was talking about. Let's shut this thing down, which, by the way, I don't want to get away from the idea of what we were talking about earlier, that thousands, hundreds of thousands, Josephus and some of the others say even millions of animals were killed during Passover week. I think that's overblown, but regardless, it's a lot of animals. It's a lot of bloodshed, blood flowing around everywhere. There's I believe it's in the Talmud and the Mishnah accounts where there's so many animals being killed that priests are wading up to their ankles in blood. It's a slaughterhouse. It's a full-on slaughterhouse. Do you think Jesus would support that? Do you think that Jesus would support that as God's holy place where prayer is? Just bloodshed and animal scream. By the way, Wes or Stephen, have you ever been to an animal sacrifice? Have you ever witnessed one?
Yeah, I've so when I worked in the Middle East, I killed my own goats and ate them, and chickens.
Okay, but
I drained the blood out of them. Yeah.
Okay, I'd love to actually. We're going to do. This is a side note. You can edit this out, Aaron, if you want to, whatever. But we're doing a challenge actually soon. I'd love to film you raising an animal yourself and killing it, and in the way that Jesus would, the way that you believe Jesus would.
Yeah, so I have friends. The chair of the board of Apologetics Canada has a farm, and we slaughter his pigs and his chickens, and they are eaten. He's Romanian, and this is not something that I have any problem with. My wife grew up raising chickens, and they get killed and they get eaten. And so, I mean, yes, I would say that Jesus in his life, as we see from childhood, would have participated in this. And as he tells the leper to go participate in this, I think all the evidence is on the side of the fact that Jesus is routinely going into the temple during the times when these are being done. He's telling his disciples to prepare the Passover, which would have entailed killing a lamb. And he is, so I think, I mean, we're getting pretty late here, and I think we do need to draw to a close. But I think where the aberration is in our two perspectives is that we would say all this evidence of face value says that Jesus is participating in this. You would differ on the historicity of these particular passages, and on the basis of the fact that it does not comport with how you view your meta-narrative of Scripture in the face of what the face value reading of these texts says, but you would not interpret them that way outside of the natural, historical, critical perspective of how those passages are actually read. Is that correct?
I'm not sure what you just said, to be honest. But Jesus said, "Man, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And so Jesus condemned the Pharisees in many locations for, again, as we said earlier, forcing these ritual laws on people while neglecting the heart of the law. So to your point about the one person Jesus in Luke commands to go out, offer the sacrifice, Jesus's whole MO is that people are the most important thing in God's universe. Loving
Correct.
your neighbor as yourself is far more important than any ritual laws. So yes, right. Jesus would have definitely prioritized the person he healed being put back in the community than some stupid commandment that he doesn't agree with.
Right. Yeah. And I would agree with that. And I would say that's exactly the point of what we see in Isaiah and Jeremiah, when God is rejecting the sacrifices of the people because they're doing it for its sake. They are, the ends to the means has become the sacrifice, and they've forgotten the purpose that the holy law of God laid down in the Levitical law for why the sacrifices were done and what they represented. And they were doing them for the sake of doing them. And that's why they were rejected. And it also says he rejects the Sabbath.
There is no passage in the Old Testament where it says God wants you to sacrifice animals with a pure heart or with obedience or putting them together in any way. It is always an outright condemnation of sacrifices. And that is because thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder.
Sure.
And
but you just reject Leviticus outright, correct? You reject Leviticus and Deuteronomy outright with the sacrificial passages?
I don't reject anything. I read the Bible for what it is.
So those are passages that men have
Moses
written.
commanded that, if that's what you're asking.
Okay. So when God refers to the Levitical law and refers to it as Moses saying it, and
that's
even refers to
reasoning, the Bible says God refers to the law.
No, yeah. Jesus says
the Bible. That's in the Bible.
So you're
talking about Leviticus, no?
I'm talking about when Jesus quotes Moses. When he quotes, I mean, Deuteronomy was one of his favorite passages to quote. He quotes Leviticus, he quotes Deuteronomy, and he ascribes it to Moses. You are saying that Jesus either did not say that or he's incorrect.
Well, I don't know if Jesus said it. I wasn't there. But what does Jesus actually say, word for word, in the passage?
Right. But so you would just reject what Jesus says when it doesn't comport to what you wanted to say.
That's what it sounds like. It sounds like you pick and choose parts that are authentic and not or historical.
I don't read the Bible with a binary lens of accept or reject. I try to find the most likely interpretation of the passage.
Based on Aaron. Correct?
Do you think I'm a scholar who does my own research? I read scholarship. That's how I come to these conclusions. This is how scholars read the Bible, is they try to come to the most likely conclusion. And I think Jesus probably said that, but what did he say? What is the exact phrase?
That's also not fair because what I would say, and I believe, Aaron, you would agree with this, is that it's based on scholarship and also, again, based on God's ideal, which you, Wes, said you believe in the Garden of Eden, there would have been animal slaughter. And that would be
animal. I would say, based on an old earth perspective, that there was animal death. There wasn't human death. And Stephen may disagree with me on this. But I would take a position that what we have in Genesis chapter 1 is something very specific that is not necessarily telling us the mechanisms by which things are operating, but that it is likely an ancient Near Eastern anti-apologetic argument against the other creation narratives that are floating around in the ancient Near East. Animal death, it specifically says that when God tells Adam he will die, it's not an arbitrary concept. I believe he would have understood what death was, and
Yeah, I'm
he
talking
would have had no issue.
specifically. Okay, I'm talking specifically about animal murder for sacrifice or for consumption or anything like that, because it's very clear in Genesis 1:29 that that's not the case. Same thing in the kingdom of heaven. But could I
But
actually really?
God makes an animal hide from
That's
just
after. First of all, that's after sin. I said
Yes.
God's ideal, not
Correct.
not
It's like
sin,
God
not
made the
after
whole
sin.
universe ex nihilo.
Yes.
Yeah, he can make skins
Yes.
ex nihilo.
So, Aaron, you believe that God made the animal skin ex nihilo?
Well, that's what the passage seems to say. That seems to be the most likely interpretation. It doesn't say any killing took place or anything of the sort.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could I also just really quickly, because I like where you were going that way. I know
We
you
got to
guys got
wrap
to go
this,
soon,
guys.
but this is
I mean,
really fascinating.
We've gone so long.
Yeah,
and
we're
Cam,
I know.
everybody- I mean, I think it's been very fair. We've had 2.5 extra hours. Can we just wrap with closing statements? Keep it under 5 minutes, please, each person. And I trust me, I want to go for another 6 hours, but it's 12:30 in the morning for me and Wesley. He's got to go home
We're
to his
having fun.
family. Stephen has to teach in the morning, and I'm sure you guys have priorities. I know Aaron,
Yeah, same.
you and your wife, and everything else, and Cam,
Yeah.
I'm sure you as well. So
For sure. Anton, really quickly on that though, and it can be a no, but I just wanted to say there's a particular manuscript tradition thing that I wanted to ask
yeah,
Wes
with
about
all
that he
due
was literally
respect,
getting
Cam,
into
I
in
want
terms of
to just
Leviticus.
be respectful for Wesley and Stephen and Aaron. I mean, we've, this is a long conversation. There's so much, like, we just don't agree on things, and that's okay. But let's wrap it up.
Yeah, totally.
Stephen, if you want to go ahead and do your closing statements first, I'll let you go for it.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm trying to process all of this. It was a long conversation. I enjoyed it.
Super fun.
I'm lit up.
Yeah,
I
but
love
you're
this
3
stuff.
hours behind us, bro. It's 12:40 in the morning for us right now.
True.
Yeah,
True.
you're kind of cheating, bro.
Yeah. I'll say
We're
it's
East
almost
Coast
1
over here.
a.m. here. But no, I appreciate you both and your willingness to have the conversation. My perspective, and I know that this is Wes as well, that we believe that the Gospels are reliable accounts. We believe that Jesus was seeking to redeem creation by creating a new heaven, new earth. That is his ultimate plan. And that does also include, yes, the removal of the need of sacrifices. We believe it's no longer necessary because he is the ultimate sacrifice. And Christians who gather around the table are receiving the very body and blood of Christ by faith every time we go to the Eucharist. And that he is ultimately seeking to do what Cam had spoken about, bring the lion and the lamb, that whole idea back together in creation. It was not, as was mentioned multiple times, ideal that animals would be sacrificed. It wasn't God's plan in the original creation narrative, but post-sin, the innocent are paying for that, which is the guilty, that God did command these things. It's all through the Old Testament, that he was angry with his people for offering lesser sacrifices, not required sacrifices, like in Malachi. And that at the end of the day, there were aspects where God was more interested, most definitely, in the heart of the giver rather than the gift itself. And that is why he received Abel's sacrifice, which was a bloody sacrifice, over Cain's, which was not. It was a faith offering. Hebrews highlights that. So anything that was done not in faith was not received by God. You could offer an animal and not have the faith in it, and it was pointless. But you could also bring faith and not the animal sacrifice, and you are left without atonement, because that was the instruction of God. But the ultimate atonement, as Hebrews teaches us, is that you cannot, with the blood of bulls and goats, eradicate sin. It required a permanence, something better than animals. And that was Christ himself, who was the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And when John saw him in the visionary of the apocalypse, he saw a lamb as though it was slain, as though it was cut, as it was sheared, as it was ruined, the way that a sacrificial lamb, because he was all of those sacrifices consummated into one person, God himself, who became man, who died, who resurrected from the dead, and he is exalted to the throne that he belongs to, and that he is interceding for us, and that he is ruling over his creation, and he is receiving by faith people into his kingdom, and he is seeking to eradicate sin, evil, death, corruption, That includes human, that includes animal, so that he would bring back to this world the Edenic state that he called good. And he is going to continue to do that, but it does not eliminate these other things that we've already discussed in great depth.
Kam, I'll let you go next.
Sure. So in closing, I would say that, again, to emphasize the kingdom of heaven, which is here and now, I'm glad that we agree that Jesus put an end to all of that suffering and death and bloodshed, some form or the other. I just believe, and I see from the text, again, it's not just me. I want to reiterate that Aaron and I do read other scholarship, and that we are looking at this through a lens that many others are as well. And what I see is that the Hebrew movement from the prophets through Jesus is a restoration movement, a restoration of shalom, of God's ideal. And they're calling people away from all that bloodshed. And it does seem to me, I can't 100% approve this right now, but I would raise a challenge to even you, Wes, to look into how these institutions of animal sacrifices could have been a priestly insertion, and particularly 2 Kings 22, where Josiah finds another book of the law that's shorter, it seems to be, than the Torah. And definitely, because you're into manuscripts, check this book out, The Moses Scroll by my good friend Ross Nichols, that talks about a manuscript of the Dead Sea Scrolls that was waved off as a forgery, just like how the Ebionite gospel was waved off by Epiphanius. But it seems to be a first-person account of Deuteronomy that's got so many similarities, but it's missing an entire animal sacrificial ritual. It's not there. And there's a lot of emerging scholarship. Edon Dershowitz, Charles, Charlesworth. I forget his first name, Charlesworth. Many, Dr. James Tabor are looking into, along with Ross, the claims of the science that passed this document off as a forgery. And if it is true, I'm not saying it is, but the science is compelling. The arguments are compelling that this could be a Dead Sea Scroll and potentially the oldest biblical manuscript ever found. And so you, Wes, as someone who loves that sort of thing, check it out, because it's very, very, very fascinating. But of course, it didn't see the light of day because he was killed by suicide. Anyhow, that being said, what I do want to say is that ultimately, I see in the scripture, with that ideal that I mentioned in the kingdom of heaven and the Garden of Eden in the beginning, is that it reflects the concept of Jesus, that I have come to bring life and life abundantly, and that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And so I would argue blood ritual killing, is that of Jesus or is that of the devil? And if Jesus and if God wants blood killing of animals, then what does the devil want? What does the devil do? If God wants and desires sacrifice, blood sacrifice, and not mercy, then what does the devil want? And
he wants your soul.
Sure. Okay. I thought I was getting my closing statement. So that was just my last question is God has my soul, and it's one that wants to grow closer to, and an understanding of liberation, of peace, of justice, and of that kingdom of heaven vision where the lion lays with the lamb, and that we don't need to hurt or slaughter for any reason. And to me, it seems pretty clear in Isaiah and Jesus's words that we can repent and we can follow towards that way, and we don't need to kill animals for anything, including food. 99% of animals are killed in factory farms. So that's my piece.
Wes, go ahead.
I think I'll default to Stevens. I'm fine with that one.
Okay. Aaron, do you want to say anything?
It's getting late. Yeah, I'll make it quick. I'm super bummed, to be honest, we didn't get to the Jesus and Paul stuff. I'm sure you guys are too. But I'll just kind of give my closing thoughts on that. I think that Protestant Christianity, more so than other denominations, has this extreme emphasis on Paul's teachings. And Christianity inevitably becomes the religion about Jesus rather than the religion of Jesus. And I believe that if Christianity is a religion of Jesus, it should emphasize what Jesus emphasized, which is repent and turn your heart to God, forgive everybody their trespasses, and you will be forgiven. And if you want to enter life, love God, love neighbor. This to me is the religion of Jesus. And it's only through this religion that you can truly grow spiritually. You don't grow spiritually from believing in concepts, but by following Jesus's commandments. And so I believe we should emphasize what Jesus emphasized, and that we should practice what Jesus commanded us to practice. And many Christians would probably say that they do, but again, I've never been in a church service in my entire life where somebody said the way to eternal life is to keep the commandments, and yet that is what Jesus said. And so it's my opinion, from speaking with hundreds of former Christians and being one myself, that Christianity has been in steep decline for many decades, largely because it's kind of this bait and switch where they draw you in with Jesus and his amazing love for you. But then once they get you in, it's almost nothing but Paul. And I think Paul wrote some good stuff. But again, this should be the religion of Jesus. People want to be inspired by what Jesus was inspired by. And as awe-inspiring as the person of Jesus was, it wasn't what inspired Jesus himself. He was what he was because he knew that I and the Father are one, and not because he confessed Jesus as his personal Lord and Savior. And so I'm inspired by what inspired Jesus. I emphasize what Jesus emphasized. The centrality of my faith is to become like Jesus. To your point, Anton, at the beginning, I believe that's real Christianity. And I believe that Jesus's words alone are sufficient for salvation. I believe Jesus showed us the perfect way to God. And that way was not believing in theological facts, although I don't think it's wrong to. I'm just saying what Jesus made salvation contingent upon is obeying God's law, to love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the Jesus way that I teach. And a lot of people in the Christian world give me some flack for saying, oh, you're teaching a New Age Jesus. And I want to correct that on the record, that I'm not teaching a New Age Jesus. I am teaching the Jesus of the red letters, but I am trying to teach that Jesus to the New Age. And I understand that that can be difficult for people to understand, but I agree with Anton on this point, and probably you, Steve and Wes as well, that the New Age needs Jesus. And so sometimes there needs to be people to step in that gap. So in any case, I love you guys so much. Truly, this was so much fun. Thank you all for your time tonight, and maybe we'll do it again in the future.
Closing thoughts for me. I believe Jesus is God. I believe the Bible's sound. Aaron, I would love to invite you, Aaron, to have a conversation with myself and possibly my priest and or another Orthodox priest publicly on the record, because although I love, brother, first of all, I love that you're bringing Jesus to the New Age, because you know my background and how much I feel about that stuff. But I will say you're in a different category called New Thought, which is something we could talk about in depth. It's not quite New Age. It's kind of this nuanced thing. So we could talk about that more, and I would love to, because I think it's a really important conversation in this day and age more than ever. And a lot of those books I gave you point to some of this. So either way, I think it's a great conversation.
I would love to, brother.
Yeah, awesome, man. And I appreciate you guys for doing this. I know Wesley, Stephen, Aaron, Kam, thank you for staying longer. I'm sure we could talk all night, and it's been a pleasure to be a moderator for the first time, and it was interesting. I'm a baby Christian in all this, and all the nuance of everything was really cool. So I appreciate you guys, everyone. And we'll talk soon.
Awesome.